Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Ezra Hawthorne squinted against the scorching August sun as his patrol vehicle crawled along the dirt road 20 miles south of Bisbee. The thermometer on his dashboard read 114 degrees, and it was only 10 in the morning. After 23 years patrolling Cochise County's vast borderlands, he'd learned to read the desert's moods, and today something felt wrong. The call had come in at dawn from rancher Obadiah Whitmore, whose property stretched along 8 miles of the international border. Obadiah's voice had been steady but concerned. He'd found an abandoned camp on the far edge of his land, but this wasn't the usual migrant crossing site. There was too much blood, he'd said, and expensive equipment left behind. Ezra pulled up to the coordinates Obadiah had provided, finding the old rancher waiting in his truck, rifle across his lap. At 71, Obadiah had worked this land for 50 years and wasn't easily rattled. The fact that he'd waited for law enforcement instead of investigating further himself spoke volumes. "Morning, Sheriff," Obadiah said, stepping out of his truck. His weathered face was grim. "It's about a quarter-mile walk from here. Didn't want to drive any closer. Might disturb evidence." They walked in silence through the mesquite and creosote bushes, the only sounds their boots crunching on the hard-packed earth and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. The camp was situated in a natural depression, hidden from casual view by a ring of large boulders and tall saguaro cacti. Ezra stopped at the edge of the campsite, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. 3 high-end camping tents were arranged in a triangle, but they'd been shredded. Not cut cleanly, but torn apart with tremendous force. Expensive camping gear was scattered everywhere. Satellite phones, GPS devices, night vision equipment, and what looked like surveying tools. But it was the blood that made his stomach tighten. Dark stains covered the ground in multiple locations, far too much for anyone to have survived losing. The pattern suggested violence. Arterial spray on one tent, drag marks leading away from another, and a large pool near what had been a campfire. "When did you find this?" Ezra asked, pulling on latex gloves. "About 5 this morning. I was checking my fence line when I saw vultures circling. Thought maybe I'd lost some cattle, but found this instead." Obadiah stayed back, knowing not to contaminate the scene. "Sheriff, there's something else." These weren't migrants or drug runners. Ezra was already reaching the same conclusion. The equipment was too expensive, too specialized. He photographed everything methodically, then carefully approached one of the torn tents. Inside, he found a blood-soaked sleeping bag and a wallet that had been overlooked in whatever violence had occurred here. The ID belonged to Marcus Stone from Phoenix, an employee of Meridian Defense Contractors. Ezra recognized the company name. They were a private military contractor that sometimes worked with Border Patrol, providing training and tactical support. A search of the other tents yielded 2 more IDs: David Marsh and Anthony Reeves, both also from Meridian. Their photos showed clean-cut men in their 30s, the kind who'd seen military service and moved into private sector security work. "These men were professionals," Ezra said, examining a damaged tactical vest. "Armed, trained, and equipped with the best gear money could buy. Whatever happened here, they didn't go down easy." He found spent shell casings, 2 3 rounds from AR-15 style rifles and 9mm from sidearms. The brass was scattered in defensive positions, suggesting the men had tried to establish a perimeter. But there were no bodies, no signs of who or what they'd been shooting at. Following the blood trails led to more questions than answers. One trail ended abruptly at a large rock formation, the blood simply stopping as if the wounded person had vanished. Another led to tire tracks from what appeared to be multiple vehicles, heavy trucks based on the tread depth. Ezra called Deputy Silas Brennan for backup and to start running the IDs through the system. While waiting, he expanded his search of the area. 50 yards from the camp, hidden behind a cluster of boulders, he found something that changed the entire nature of the investigation. 3 shallow graves had been hastily dug and partially filled, but they didn't contain the missing security contractors. Instead, Ezra found himself looking at the bodies of 3 young women, all appearing to be in their late teens or early 20s. They'd been dead for several days, the desert heat accelerating decomposition, but the cause of death was clear: execution-style gunshots to the head. His radio crackled. "Sheriff, I've got information on those Meridian contractors." Silas's voice came through. According to their company, they were on a recovery mission. Seems a client's daughter was kidnapped 2 weeks ago in Phoenix. The family hired Meridian to get her back when they received proof she'd been taken across the border. Ezra looked back at the bodies. One of them matched the general description Silas was giving him of the kidnapped girl. Rebecca Ashford, 19, daughter of a tech executive who'd made millions in government contracts. "Silas, we're going to need the FBI, state police, and a forensics team out here. This isn't just a kidnapping gone wrong. We're looking at something much bigger." As he waited for backup, Ezra studied the scene more carefully. The security contractors had clearly tracked the kidnappers to this location and attempted a rescue. Based on the evidence, they'd found the kidnapped victims already dead, which meant they'd walked into a trap. But who had killed 3 trained military contractors and removed their bodies without leaving a trace? The amount of blood suggested they'd been badly wounded or killed on site, yet someone had taken the time and effort to remove them while leaving everything else behind. A glint of metal caught his eye near one of the graves. Ezra knelt and carefully extracted a small pendant from the dirt, a St. Jude medallion on a broken chain. He bagged it as evidence, but something about it nagged at him. He'd seen similar medallions before, worn by Mexican federal police officers he'd worked with on cross-border operations. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging or more will die." Ezra immediately tried to trace the number, but it was already dead. Someone was watching, someone who knew he was here and what he'd found. He scanned the surrounding hills, looking for the telltale glint of binocular lenses or scope glass, but saw nothing. The forensics team arrived 2 hours later, along with a full contingent of federal agents. The scene was processed with methodical precision, every piece of evidence cataloged and analyzed. The 3 young women were confirmed to be kidnapping victims: Rebecca Ashford and 2 others who'd been grabbed from Tucson and Flagstaff over the past month. But it was the blood evidence that proved most interesting. DNA analysis would later confirm that it belonged to the 3 Meridian contractors, but mixed in were traces of blood from at least 4 other individuals who weren't in any database. Whoever had ambushed the contractors had taken casualties of their own. As the sun set over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of red and purple, Ezra stood at the edge of the crime scene, trying to piece together what had happened. 3 kidnapped women, executed before the rescue attempt. 3 military contractors, ambushed and their bodies taken. And an unknown number of kidnappers who'd managed to escape with their wounded or dead. This wasn't the work of a typical cartel or smuggling operation. This was something more organized, more sophisticated. someone had been using the isolation of the borderlands to run a kidnapping ring, targeting specific victims for ransom or worse. And when a rescue attempt was mounted, they'd been ready. The investigation was just beginning, but Ezra already knew this case would consume his life for the foreseeable future. 3 families needed answers about their daughters. 3 more families needed to know what happened to the men who'd tried to save them. And somewhere out there, the people responsible were still operating, still hunting, still killing. As he drove back to the station in the darkness, his radio crackled with another call. A vehicle matching the description of one seen near the crime scene had been spotted heading toward Douglas. Ezra turned his patrol car around and accelerated into the night. The hunt was on. The moon rose over the Sonoran Desert, casting long shadows across the landscape. In those shadows, predators both human and animal moved through the darkness. But tonight, Sheriff Ezra Hawthorne was the hunter, and he wouldn't stop until he found the truth about what happened at that bloody campsite. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, another message. The girls were just the beginning. Stay away or join them. Ezra deleted the message and kept driving. After 23 years in law enforcement, he'd learned one truth above all others. The moment you let fear dictate your actions was the moment you lost. And he had no intention of losing. Not when 3 young women deserved justice. Not when 3 brave men had died trying to save them. And not when the killers were still out there, planning their next move in this deadly game of cat and mouse across the unforgiving Arizona desert. The vehicle Deputy Silas Brennan had spotted turned out to be a false lead, just a rancher heading home late from Tucson. But the failed pursuit had given Ezra time to think, to process what they'd found at the campsite. By the time he returned to the station at midnight, he had a theory forming. The sheriff's department in Bisbee was a modest building, built in the 1970s and showing its age. But it was home to Ezra, the place where he'd built his career and reputation. Tonight, it was also command central for what was becoming a multi-agency investigation. FBI Special Agent Diana Crawford had arrived from Phoenix, along with a DEA liaison and 2 investigators from the Arizona Department of Public Safety. They'd commandeered the conference room, turning it into a makeshift operations center with laptops, secure phones, and a large map of Cochise County marked with red pins. Sheriff Hawthorne, Crawford said as he entered. She was in her 40s, professional and sharp, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. We've been going through the Meridian contractors' communications. They were tracking the kidnappers for 3 days before the confrontation. She pulled up emails on her laptop. Marcus Stone was keeping their home office updated. According to his last message, sent 6 hours before we estimate the attack occurred, they'd identified the kidnappers as members of a group calling themselves Los Fantasmas, the Ghosts. Ezra had heard whispers of Los Fantasmas, but had always assumed they were myth, border legend. Supposedly, they were former Mexican special forces who'd gone rogue, working as kidnappers and assassins for the highest bidder. If they were real and operating in his county, this case had just become exponentially more dangerous. There's more, Crawford continued. The Ashford family didn't just hire Meridian randomly. Rebecca's father, Thomas Ashford, has defense contracts worth hundreds of millions. We think Rebecca wasn't a random target. She was grabbed specifically to leverage her father. What kind of leverage? Ezra asked. That's what we're trying to figure out. Ashford's company develops surveillance technology for border security. It's possible someone wanted access to that technology or wanted to prevent its deployment. Deputy Silas Brennan entered the room, his face grave. Sheriff, we just got a call from the hospital in Douglas. A man was dropped off at the emergency room an hour ago with severe gunshot wounds. He's in surgery, but the doctors say he's Mexican federal police. They found his badge sewn into his jacket lining. Ezra and Crawford exchanged glances. A wounded Mexican federal officer, appearing the same night they'd found the massacre site, couldn't be coincidence. They drove to Douglas through the dark desert highways, arriving at the small regional hospital just as the surgeon emerged from the operating room. Dr. Patricia Morales looked exhausted, her scrubs blood-stained despite her protective gear. "He's stable, but critical," she reported. 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the torso, 1 to the shoulder. He's lost a lot of blood, and there's significant tissue damage. If he survives the next 24 hours, he might make it. "Can we speak with him?" Crawford asked. "He's unconscious and will be for hours, maybe days. But there's something you should know. His wounds are at least 3 days old. Someone's been treating him, keeping him alive, before dumping him here." In the recovery room, Ezra studied the unconscious man. Late 30s, military-style haircut, scars that suggested a violent career. His hands had recent abrasions consistent with firing a weapon, and there was dried blood under his fingernails that probably wasn't his own. Crawford ran his fingerprints through international databases, while Ezra examined the man's personal effects. The jacket with the hidden badge identified him as Commander Miguel Herrera of the Federal Police's anti-kidnapping unit. But there was something else. A small notebook hidden in his boot, its pages filled with cramped Spanish writing. Ezra's Spanish was functional after decades on the border, and what he read made his blood run cold. Herrera had been undercover, infiltrating Los Fantasmas for 6 months. His notes detailed kidnapping operations, murder-for-hire contracts, and corruption that reached into both Mexican and American law enforcement. One entry, dated a week ago, mentioned the American girls and plans to use them as bait for a larger operation. Herrera had tried to prevent their murders, but had been discovered as a spy. The confrontation at the campsite hadn't been a rescue mission interrupted. It had been a carefully orchestrated trap. "They knew Meridian was coming," Ezra said, showing Crawford the notebook. "They executed the girls to draw them in, then ambushed them. But Herrera tried to stop it, which is how he got shot." "Which means the bodies of the contractors were taken for a reason," Crawford reasoned. "Los Fantasmas doesn't do anything without purpose." Ezra's phone rang. It was Obadiah Whitmore, the rancher who'd found the campsite. His voice was strained, fearful. "Sheriff, there are men at my gate." "Armed men. They're saying they want to talk to you, that they have information about what happened on my land. Don't let them in, Obadiah." "Lock your doors and stay armed. We're on our way." The drive to the Whitmore ranch took 20 minutes, every one of them tense. Ezra called for all available backup, but he knew they'd arrive at least 10 minutes after him and Crawford. As they approached the ranch gate, their headlights illuminated 3 vehicles, black SUVs with Sonora plates. A man stood beside the lead vehicle, hands visible but clearly armed. He was tall, wearing expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the desert night. When Ezra stepped out of his patrol car, weapon drawn but pointed down, the man smiled. "Sheriff Hawthorne. My name is Alejandro Vega. I believe you've been looking into some recent unpleasantness on this ranch." "Identify yourself properly," Ezra commanded, "and tell your men to show their hands." Vega nodded, and 4 other men stepped out of the vehicles, hands raised but weapons visible in holsters. "I represent certain interests in Mexico that are concerned about Los Fantasmas and their activities. We have a mutual problem, Sheriff." "Your cartel," Crawford stated flatly, her hand on her weapon. "Such a crude term," Vega replied. I prefer to think of myself as a businessman, and right now, my business is being disrupted by Los Fantasmas. They're causing too much attention, too much heat, bad for everyone's operations. Why should we listen to anything you have to say? Ezra asked. Because I know where the bodies of the Meridian contractors are, and I know Los Fantasmas' next target. Vega pulled out a phone, showing them a photo. It was clearly taken recently, showing 3 bodies in the back of a truck. They planned to use the contractors' corpses and equipment to infiltrate a border patrol facility tomorrow night. They have someone inside who will ensure the bodies are identified as active agents. The implications were staggering. If Los Fantasmas could pose as federal agents, they could move freely across the border, access secure facilities, and carry out operations with impunity. What do you want in exchange for this information? Crawford asked. Nothing from you. I simply want Los Fantasmas eliminated. They're bad for business, as I said. The location where they're holding the bodies is an abandoned warehouse outside Agua Prieta. You'll find approximately 12 members of Los Fantasmas there, preparing for tomorrow's operation. Vega handed Ezra a piece of paper with GPS coordinates. You have perhaps 6 hours before they move. After that, your chance is gone. This could be a trap, Crawford pointed out. It could be, Vega agreed, but ask yourself, what do I gain from eliminating American law enforcement? That would bring the kind of attention that destroys business. Los Fantasmas, however, they don't care about consequences. They're idealists, revolutionaries. They think they're fighting a war. With that, Vega and his men got back in their vehicles and drove away into the night, leaving Ezra and Crawford to make an impossible decision. Trust a cartel operative's intelligence, or risk letting Los Fantasmas carry out whatever operation they had planned. Backup arrived minutes later. State police, border patrol, and even a tactical team from Phoenix. The debate was quick but heated. Some wanted to verify the intelligence first. Others wanted to move immediately. In the end, it was Commander Herrera's notebook that decided it. His notes mentioned the same warehouse, identified as a Los Fantasmas safe house. The raid was planned for 4 a.m., that dead hour when human alertness is at its lowest. 40 officers from various agencies assembled at a staging area 5 miles from the target. Drone surveillance confirmed activity at the warehouse. Heat signatures of multiple individuals, vehicles matching those seen near crime scenes. Ezra insisted on being part of the entry team despite Crawford's objections. This had started in his county, with bodies found on a ranch he'd known since childhood. He needed to see it through. The warehouse sat isolated in the desert, a relic from more prosperous times when mining had driven the local economy. Now, it was perfect for illicit activities. Remote, with multiple escape routes, and close enough to the border for quick runs into Mexico. The assault began with flashbang grenades and tear gas, followed by tactical teams entering from multiple points. The firefight was brief but intense. Los Fantasmas had been ready for trouble, but not for the overwhelming force that hit them. When the smoke cleared, 8 members of Los Fantasmas were dead, 3 wounded and in custody, and 1 had escaped into the desert. They found the bodies of the 3 Meridian contractors, along with uniforms and identification that would have allowed the kidnappers to pose as Border Patrol agents. But they also found something else: detailed plans for an attack on a Border Patrol detention facility, intended to free several high-value prisoners being held for deportation. The contractors' bodies were to be the Trojan horse, brought in as casualties from a supposed border incident. As dawn broke over the desert, Ezra stood outside the warehouse, watching as evidence was cataloged and bodies were removed. They'd stopped a major attack, rescued the contractors' bodies for proper burial, and dealt a significant blow to Los Fantasmas. But questions remained. Who inside Border Patrol had been willing to help Los Fantasmas? Who had hired them to kidnap Rebecca Ashford and the other girls? And where was the one member who had escaped? Crawford approached him, looking as tired as he felt. The wounded suspects are talking, trying to make deals. One of them says Los Fantasmas was hired by someone in Phoenix, someone with connections to defense contracting. They were supposed to grab the girls to pressure their families into providing technology and information. Thomas Ashford's surveillance technology, Ezra said. Among other things, this goes deeper than just kidnapping for ransom. Someone was trying to compromise border security at the highest levels. A helicopter arrived to transport the wounded suspects and evidence to Phoenix. As Ezra watched it disappear into the morning sky, he thought about the 3 young women buried in shallow graves. Their lives ended for someone's greed and ambition. Justice had been partially served, but the masterminds were still out there. The interrogation rooms at the federal building in Phoenix were stark, designed to break down psychological defenses. Ezra watched through one-way glass as FBI interrogators worked on the captured Los Fantasmas members. After 16 hours, they were beginning to crack. The youngest, barely 22, was named Carlos Mendoza. He'd joined Los Fantasmas 6 months ago, drawn by promises of easy money and excitement. Now, facing life in federal prison, he was eager to talk. The American who hired us, he never gave his real name, Carlos said, his voice shaky. We called him El Ingeniero, the engineer. He knew things, government things. He knew when Border Patrol would change shifts, when transfers would happen, which detention facilities had the weakest security. Special Agent Crawford leaned forward. Describe him. Tall, maybe 50 years old, gray hair, spoke Spanish with an American accent, always wore expensive suits. He met with our leader, Ramon Diaz, 3 times that I saw. The last time was a week before we grabbed the girls. Ezra felt his blood run cold. The description matched someone he knew, someone who shouldn't have any connection to this case. He stepped out of the observation room and made a call to his office. Silas, I need you to pull everything we have on Robert Newcomb. Robert Newcomb was a former Border Patrol sector chief who'd retired 5 years ago and started a consulting firm. He'd worked with Ezra on numerous cases, had been a trusted colleague, but he also had access to the kind of information Los Fantasmas had been using. While waiting for the information, Ezra returned to the observation room. Carlos was now describing the kidnapping operations in detail. The girls weren't random. El Ingeniero gave us their names, their routines, their photos. He said their families had things he needed: technology, access codes, classified information. The Ashford girl, her father's company, was developing some kind of radar system that could see through walls, track people underground. El Ingeniero wanted the prototypes and the software. What about the Meridian contractors? Crawford asked. We knew they were coming. El Ingeniero had someone inside Meridian, someone who told him about the rescue mission. We were supposed to capture them alive, use them to access military bases. But Commander Herrera... Carlos stopped, fear crossing his face. Herrera was one of you? No. He was a federal cop, undercover. When he tried to save the girls, Ramon shot them all. Then Herrera shot Ramon and 2 others before we got him. Everything went wrong after that. In another interrogation room, one of the wounded Los Fantasmas members, Jorge Salinas, was providing different pieces of the puzzle. He was older, had been with the group longer, and knew more about their operations. El Ingeniero wasn't just hiring us for kidnappings, Jorge revealed. he was building something bigger. He talked about creating chaos on the border, making the government look weak, incompetent. He said when the time was right, his company would get billions in contracts to fix the problems he'd created. The pieces were falling into place. Someone was playing both sides, creating border security crises, then positioning themselves to profit from the solution. It was a scheme that required inside knowledge, connections, and complete ruthlessness. Deputy Brennan called Ezra with the information on Robert Newcomb. "Sheriff, you're not going to like this." Newcomb's consulting firm, Southwest Security Solutions, just landed a preliminary contract worth $200 million to develop new border surveillance technology. And guess who his main competitor was? Thomas Ashford's company. When was the contract awarded? 2 days after Rebecca Ashford was kidnapped. The timeline was damning. Newcomb had used the kidnapping to eliminate his competition, probably planning to have Thomas Ashford either killed or blackmailed into withdrawing from the contract. The other kidnapped girls were likely leverage against their families too, all connected to border security or government contracts in some way. Crawford was already coordinating with the Phoenix FBI office to bring Newcomb in for questioning. But when agents arrived at his home in Scottsdale, they found it empty. Neighbors reported seeing moving trucks there 2 days ago. Newcomb had disappeared. His office was similarly abandoned, but in his haste to leave, Newcomb had made mistakes. Forensic computer specialists recovered partially deleted files from a server, including encrypted communications with someone using the handle Ghost Leader, presumably Ramon Diaz, the dead leader of Los Fantasmas. The messages laid out the entire conspiracy. Newcomb had been planning this for 2 years, identifying vulnerable points in border security, recruiting corrupt officials, and building relationships with criminal organizations. He'd provided Los Fantasmas with intelligence, equipment, and cover in exchange for their services. But the most shocking revelation came from a financial analysis. Newcomb wasn't working alone. The money trail led to a shell company registered in Delaware, which led to another in the Cayman Islands, which finally traced back to a defense contractor called Pinnacle Solutions, a major player in the military-industrial complex with contracts worth billions. Pinnacle's CEO, William Garrison, was a former Pentagon official with deep connections in Washington. If he was involved, this conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government and industry. That evening, Commander Miguel Herrera finally regained consciousness. Weak but lucid, he confirmed much of what they'd learned and added crucial details. "I've been tracking Los Fantasmas for 2 years," he said through cracked lips. "They started as idealists, former soldiers who thought they were fighting corruption. But the money corrupted them. When El Ingeniero, Newcomb, approached them, they became his private army." "Do you know where Newcomb might run?" Ezra asked. "He has a place in Mexico in Sonora. A ranch called Vista del Sol, about 50 miles south of Agua Prieta. Los Fantasmas provided security for it. But Sheriff, he's not the top. There are others. Powerful people who want chaos on the border because chaos means profit." The investigation had expanded beyond anything Ezra had imagined when he'd first stood over those bodies in the desert. Federal agencies were now involved at the highest levels. Congressional committees were asking questions, and the media was beginning to sniff around the edges of the story. But for Ezra, it remained personal. 3 young women were dead, their lives sacrificed for money and power. 3 brave men had died trying to save them, and the man responsible was still free, possibly planning his next move from a fortified ranch in Mexico. The Mexican government, embarrassed by the Los Fantasmas revelations and grateful for Commander Herrera's survival, agreed to a joint operation. Mexican federal police would raid the Vista del Sol ranch, while American forces waited at the border to arrest Newcomb if he tried to flee north. The raid was scheduled for dawn, 3 days after the warehouse assault. Ezra positioned himself at the Douglas port of entry, watching the feeds from drones circling the ranch. The property was massive, with a main house, several outbuildings, and a private airstrip. As the Mexican forces moved in, Ezra could see figures scattering from the buildings. Gunfire erupted, brief but intense. Then, a small plane started rolling down the airstrip. Newcomb was trying to escape by air. Mexican helicopters moved to intercept, but the plane was already airborne, heading north toward the border. This was what they'd prepared for. Air Force jets scrambled from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, ready to force the plane down. But Newcomb had one more card to play. The plane suddenly changed course, diving low and heading for the mountains. For a terrifying moment, it looked like he might escape into the rugged terrain where tracking would be nearly impossible. Then the plane's engine sputtered and died. Whether from mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion, Newcomb was going down. The plane crashed in a remote canyon 15 miles north of the border, in Ezra's jurisdiction. Search and rescue teams found the wreckage 2 hours later. Newcomb had survived, but was badly injured. His legs broken, internal injuries keeping him immobilized. As Ezra approached the crashed plane, Newcomb looked up at him with eyes that held no remorse. "You have no idea what you've done," Newcomb gasped through pain. "The system I was building would have worked. Real security, real control. Now, it'll just be chaos, and more people will die." "You killed 3 innocent young women," Ezra replied coldly. "You got 3 good men killed trying to save them. That's all I need to know." As medical teams extracted Newcomb from the wreckage, he made one last statement. "Garrison will never be touched. He's too connected, too protected. I'm just the fall guy." The system continues, Sheriff. It always continues. The arrest of Robert Newcomb made national news. The story of corruption, murder, and conspiracy shocked the public and triggered congressional hearings. But as the weeks passed, Ezra watched with frustration as the investigation stalled at higher levels. William Garrison and Pinnacle Solutions hired the best lawyers money could buy. They claimed Newcomb was a rogue contractor, that they had no knowledge of his activities. Without direct evidence linking Garrison to the conspiracy, evidence that mysteriously disappeared or was deemed inadmissible, prosecutors couldn't touch him. Newcomb, facing multiple life sentences, refused to testify against his former partners. Whether from loyalty, fear, or some twisted sense of honor, he took full responsibility while insisting he'd acted alone. Commander Herrera recovered and returned to Mexico, where he received commendations for his undercover work. Before leaving, he met with Ezra one last time. "This is how it always ends," Herrera said sadly. "The little fish get caught, the big fish swim away. But we saved lives, Sheriff. We stopped Los Fantasmas, prevented that attack on the detention facility. Sometimes that has to be enough." 3 months after the bodies were found on Obadiah Whitmore's ranch, Ezra stood at the graves of Rebecca Ashford and the 2 other young women. Their families had come for a memorial service, seeking closure that the justice system had only partially provided. Thomas Ashford approached Ezra after the service. "Sheriff, I know you did everything you could. Newcomb will rot in prison, and that's something. But we both know others are still out there." "Yes, sir, they are. My company is developing new technology, better ways to monitor the border without violence, without walls, real security through intelligence and early warning. Would you consult for us? Help us understand the real challenges down here?" Ezra considered the offer. After everything that had happened, returning to routine patrol seemed impossible. The border had always been dangerous, but now he'd seen how deep the corruption ran, how money and power could turn security into a commodity to be manipulated for profit. "I'll think about it," he said. As the families departed, Ezra remained at the cemetery, looking out over the desert landscape he'd protected for over 2 decades. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. Somewhere out there, coyotes were leading groups across the border. Drug runners were planning their next shipments, and perhaps another conspiracy was taking shape. But also, out there were good people like Obadiah Whitmore, watching over their land, reporting suspicious activity, standing against the darkness. There were officers like Deputy Brennan, investigators like Agent Crawford, and brave undercover agents like Commander Herrera, all fighting to maintain order in a chaotic world. The border would always be a place of conflict, where nations, cultures, and laws collided. But it was also home to millions of people who deserved safety and justice. That's what Ezra had sworn to provide 23 years ago, and despite everything, he still believed in that oath. 6 months after Robert Newcomb's arrest, Sheriff Ezra Hawthorne found himself testifying before a congressional subcommittee investigating border security corruption. The wood-paneled hearing room in Washington, D.C. felt a world away from the Arizona desert he called home. "Sheriff Hawthorne," the committee chair began, "your investigation uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of our border security apparatus. Can you tell us what vulnerabilities allowed this to happen?" Ezra leaned into the microphone. "Senator, the primary vulnerability was trust. We trusted that those sworn to protect our borders would honor that oath. Robert Newcomb used his position, his knowledge, and our trust to orchestrate murders and compromise national security for profit. For 3 hours he detailed the investigation, the connections between Newcomb and Los Fantasmas, and the involvement of defense contractors in creating border chaos for financial gain. Several committee members seemed genuinely shocked by the revelations. Others appeared uncomfortable, perhaps knowing how deep these connections ran. After his testimony, Ezra was approached in the hallway by a woman he didn't recognize. She was in her 40s, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone used to authority. "Sheriff Hawthorne, I'm Jessica Thornton, Department of Justice, Special Prosecutions Unit. I'd like to speak with you privately." They found an empty conference room. Thornton closed the door and checked that they weren't being recorded before speaking. "Sheriff, your testimony today was powerful, but we both know you held back. You didn't mention Pinnacle Solutions or William Garrison once. I was advised to stick to the facts of my direct investigation," Ezra replied carefully. "By whom?" When Ezra didn't answer, Thornton continued. "Sheriff, I'm building a case against Garrison and others involved in what we're calling the border conspiracy. But I need witnesses willing to testify about the connections you uncovered." Newcomb won't talk. "The Los Fantasmas members who survived are too scared. Commander Herrera is in Mexico, out of our jurisdiction. What exactly do you want from me?" Thornton pulled out a file. 3 weeks ago, a Pinnacle Solutions employee named David came to us. He's their IT director, and he has proof that Garrison was directly involved in planning the kidnappings. Encrypted communications, financial transfers, even recordings of phone calls. But David is terrified. He needs protection, and he needs to know that local law enforcement will support this investigation. You want me to protect a whistleblower? I want you to help me bring down the entire network. David is in hiding in Arizona, in your jurisdiction. If you can keep him safe until trial, his testimony could expose not just Garrison but a dozen other contractors and corrupt officials. Ezra thought about the 3 young women buried in the desert, about the Meridian contractors who died trying to save them. Justice had been only partially served. This was a chance to finish what they'd started. Where is he? 2 days later, Ezra was back in Arizona, driving through the pre-dawn darkness toward Tombstone. David was hiding in a safe house there, protected by U.S. Marshals but isolated and terrified. Thornton had arranged for Ezra to meet him, to provide local support and credibility. The safe house was a nondescript ranch property 5 miles outside town. Ezra was cleared through 3 security checkpoints before reaching the main house, where he found David pacing nervously in the living room. David was younger than Ezra expected, maybe 35, with the pallor of someone who spent most of his time in server rooms and offices. His hands shook as he shook Ezra's hand. "Sheriff Hawthorne, thank you for coming. I've followed your investigation. You're the only one who seemed to care about the truth. Tell me what you know, mister." David. For the next 3 hours, David laid out a conspiracy that dwarfed what Ezra had uncovered. Pinnacle Solutions, along with 4 other major defense contractors, had been systematically creating border security crises for 5 years. They would identify vulnerabilities, share that information with criminal organizations, then bid on contracts to fix the problems they'd helped create. Garrison called it market development, David said bitterly. Create demand for your product by making the current solutions fail. The kidnappings were just one operation. There have been dozens. Drug tunnels that were conveniently discovered just as new detection technology contracts were up for bid. Cyber attacks on Border Patrol databases just before cybersecurity contracts were awarded. And you have proof of all this. David pulled out an encrypted hard drive. Everything's on here. Emails, financial records, recordings. I started collecting evidence 2 years ago when I realized what was happening. But I was too scared to come forward until those girls were killed. That wasn't supposed to happen. They were just supposed to be leveraged, then released. But Los Fantasmas had their own agenda. Exactly. Garrison lost control of his assets. That's when I knew I had to act. Over the following weeks, Ezra worked with the marshals to keep David safe while Thornton built her case. It wasn't easy. Twice, unknown vehicles were spotted conducting surveillance on the safe house. Once, someone tried to hack into the marshal's communication system. Deputy Silas Brennan proved invaluable, organizing local law enforcement to provide additional security without drawing attention. Rancher Obadiah Whitmore, whose land had been the original crime scene, offered his property as an alternate safe house, with its clear sightlines and defensible position. The threat became real one night when a team of professional mercenaries attempted to breach the safe house. They disabled the alarms and were moving in when one of Obadiah's ranch hands, on loan as additional security, spotted them. The resulting firefight was brief but intense. 2 mercenaries were killed, 3 captured. Under interrogation, the captured men revealed they'd been hired through intermediaries, paid in cryptocurrency, and given detailed intelligence about the safe house security. Someone with resources and connections was trying to silence David before he could testify. The attempted attack actually strengthened Thornton's case. The captured mercenaries' equipment was traced back to a Pinnacle Solutions subsidiary, and their payment was linked to accounts controlled by Garrison's associates. William Garrison was arrested at his Virginia estate on a morning when he was hosting a fundraiser for several congressional representatives. The image of him being led away in handcuffs while politicians scattered became iconic, symbolizing the intersection of corruption and power that had enabled the conspiracy. The trial was held in Phoenix with unprecedented security. Ezra testified again, this time holding nothing back. He described finding the bodies, tracking the conspiracy, and protecting the witness whose testimony was exposing the entire network. David's testimony was devastating. He presented evidence methodically, showing how Garrison and others had orchestrated chaos for profit, treating human lives as acceptable collateral damage. The defense attorneys tried to discredit him, but the evidence was overwhelming. On the trial's 10th day, Robert Newcomb surprised everyone by agreeing to testify. Facing life in prison regardless, perhaps he'd decided that protecting Garrison was no longer worth it. Or perhaps he simply wanted to ensure that if he was going down, everyone involved would go with him. Newcomb's testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. 17 defense contractors had been involved to varying degrees. 31 government officials had been bribed or blackmailed. The network had generated over $3 billion in fraudulent contracts over 5 years. "We didn't invent corruption," Newcomb said from the witness stand. "We just organized it, made it efficient. The border has always been a place where money and blood mix. We just found a way to profit from it." The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, William Garrison was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, murder, racketeering, terrorism, and more. He was sentenced to life without parole. 14 other defendants received sentences ranging from 20 years to life. But the victory felt hollow to Ezra. The 3 young women were still dead. The 3 Meridian contractors were still dead. Commander Herrera still carried the scars from his undercover work. And while the main conspirators were in prison, the system that had allowed them to operate remained largely intact. A month after the trial, Ezra met with Thomas Ashford, Rebecca's father, at the cemetery where she was buried. Ashford had aged visibly, his hair now completely gray, his face lined with grief that would never fully fade. "Was justice served, Sheriff?" Ashford asked, staring at his daughter's headstone. "The people responsible are in prison," Ezra replied. "But justice? I don't know if there's enough justice in the world for what they did. I'm selling my company," Ashford said quietly. "Getting out of the defense business entirely. I'm using the money to create a foundation in Rebecca's name to help families of kidnapping victims. Will you serve on the board?" Ezra agreed. It was a small gesture against an ocean of violence and corruption, but small gestures were how change began. 3 years later, Sheriff Ezra Hawthorne retired after 26 years in law enforcement. The border had changed during his tenure, becoming more militarized, more surveilled, but in many ways no safer. The cartels adapted to every new technology, every new strategy. The cycle of violence and enforcement continued. On his last day, Ezra drove out to the spot where everything had started: Obadiah Whitmore's ranch, the site of that terrible discovery. The blood had long since been washed away by rain and wind, the evidence of violence erased by time and nature. Obadiah met him there, now 74, and moving slower but still sharp-eyed and vigilant. "Thinking about what might have been?" Obadiah asked. "Thinking about what was," Ezra replied. 3 young women who should be alive. 3 good men who died trying to save them. A conspiracy that reached into the heart of our government. And all for money. You stopped them, Ezra. You and the others. That counts for something. Does it? There'll be another Newcomb, another Garrison. Different names, same greed. The border's too profitable for the violence to ever really stop." Obadiah was quiet for a moment, then said, "My grandfather used to say that evil is like the desert. It's always there, always waiting. But so is good. The choice is which one we water, which one we help grow." As the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, painting the landscape in shades of red and gold, Ezra thought about those words. He'd spent his career trying to water the good, to protect the innocent, to to serve justice. Sometimes he'd succeeded, sometimes he'd failed, but he'd never stopped trying. Deputy Silas Brennan was sheriff now, younger and perhaps more idealistic than Ezra had become. He would face his own challenges, his own conspiracies, his own moments of triumph and defeat. The cycle would continue. But so would the resistance to evil. In every generation, in every community, there would be those who stood against the darkness. Law enforcement officers who couldn't be bought, prosecutors who wouldn't be intimidated, witnesses brave enough to testify, and ordinary citizens who reported what they saw. Ezra's phone rang. It was Jessica Thornton, now heading a special task force on border corruption. "Sheriff, sorry, Mr. Hawthorne. We've uncovered another network, similar to Pinnacle but operating out of Texas. I could use your expertise as a consultant." Ezra looked out over the desert, then at Obadiah, who nodded knowingly. "Send me the files," Ezra said. "I'll take a look." He might be retired from law enforcement, but he wasn't retired from the fight for justice. The 3 young women in their graves deserved that much. The 3 contractors who'd died trying to save them deserved that much. Everyone who'd suffered because of greed and corruption deserved that much. The border would always be a battleground between law and chaos, between those who protected and those who exploited. But as long as there were people willing to stand against the darkness, there was hope. Not for perfect justice, not for absolute safety, but for the possibility that good could prevail more often than not. As Ezra drove away from the ranch, heading toward his new role as a consultant and advocate, he carried with him the weight of all he'd seen, and the determination to use that knowledge to prevent future tragedies. The desert stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, but also beautiful in its harsh honesty. The Border Patrol incident, as the media had dubbed it, was over, but its echoes would resonate for years, a reminder that the price of justice is eternal vigilance, and that sometimes the greatest threats come not from outside our borders, but from within our own institutions. Sheriff Ezra Hawthorne was no longer sheriff, but he would always be a guardian of justice, watching over the borderlands he loved, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and standing against the darkness wherever it emerged from the desert shadows. Sheriff Amos Claiborne stood at the Peralta trailhead in the Superstition Mountains, studying the abandoned Toyota Camry that had been parked there for 6 days. The morning sun was already brutal at 7 a.m., promising another scorching September day in the Arizona wilderness. At 61, Amos had spent 18 years as sheriff of Pinal County, and he'd pulled too many bodies from these mountains to be optimistic about finding Jeremiah Blackstone alive. The call had come from Jeremiah's sister in Phoenix. Her brother, a 34-year-old investment banker, had taken a week off to find himself in the wilderness. He was supposed to return 4 days ago. His car was here, his apartment in Scottsdale was empty, and his cell phone's last ping had been from a tower near the trailhead 6 days ago. Deputy Marcus Hoffman, young and eager at 28, was already interviewing the camp host at the nearby Lost Dutchman State Park. Amos examined Jeremiah's vehicle carefully. It was locked, windows up, nothing obviously disturbed. Through the window, he could see an expensive day pack in the back seat, along with several bottles of water and energy bars. Supplies that should have been taken on a hike. "That's strange," Amos muttered to himself. His radio crackled. "Sheriff, this is Marcus." The camp host remembers seeing Blackstone. Says he talked to him 6 days ago around dawn. Blackstone asked about the trail to Weaver's Needle, seemed excited but prepared. Weaver's Needle was a volcanic plug formation deep in the Superstitions, a challenging hike even for experienced outdoorsmen. For a city banker trying to find himself, it could be deadly. Did he mention meeting anyone? Amos asked. That's the interesting part, Sheriff. The host says Blackstone was asking about someone named Ephraim Dutton. Said he was supposed to meet a guide with that name. Amos felt a chill despite the rising heat. He knew most of the legitimate guides who worked the superstitions, and none were named Ephraim Dutton. More concerning was that guides typically met clients at established locations in town, not at remote trailheads. He called dispatch to run a check on Ephraim Dutton while he organized a search team. Within an hour, he had assembled 8 experienced search and rescue volunteers, including Tom Rodriguez, who'd been pulling people out of the superstitions for 20 years. Tom, you ever heard of a guide named Ephraim Dutton? Tom's weathered face creased in thought. No, and I know everyone who guides these mountains. If someone's using that name, they're not legitimate. The background check came back with disturbing information. Ephraim Dutton existed, but he was 73 years old and currently serving a life sentence in Florence State Prison for murder. He'd been convicted 15 years ago of killing 2 hikers in these same mountains, though he'd always maintained his innocence. Someone's using a convicted killer's name as an alias, Deputy Hoffman observed. That can't be coincidence. Amos agreed. This was no longer just a missing hiker case. Someone had lured Jeremiah Blackstone into the mountains under false pretenses. The question was why. The search team spread out along the Peralta Trail, the main route toward Weaver's Needle. The trail was well marked for the first 2 miles, but then it branched into multiple primitive paths that crisscrossed the wilderness. If Blackstone had gone off trail with his mysterious guide, finding him would be like looking for a specific grain of sand in the desert. 3 miles in, they found the first clue. A water bottle, expensive brand, with JB written on it in permanent marker. It was sitting on a rock beside the trail, placed there deliberately rather than dropped. He's leaving markers, Tom observed. Smart man. They found more signs over the next mile. A torn piece of cloth tied to a bush, a cairn of rocks that wasn't there on Tom's last trip a week ago, and finally, a hiking boot print in a sandy wash that was definitely fresh. But there were 2 sets of prints. Size 10.5, probably Blackstone based on the tread pattern. That's the expensive Salomon boot, Tom analyzed. The other is bigger, maybe size 12, and wearing old-style military surplus boots. Haven't seen those in years. The tracks led off the main trail into a narrow canyon that Tom said he'd never explored in all his years in the superstitions. The walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a corridor of shade that dropped the temperature by 20 degrees. I don't like this, Tom said quietly. This is perfect ambush territory. They proceeded carefully, calling out Blackstone's name every few minutes. The canyon twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing to just a few feet wide. After a mile, it opened into a small basin surrounded by cliff walls. In the center was an old stone cabin, partially collapsed but showing signs of recent activity. That shouldn't be here, Tom said. I've got every structure in these mountains mapped, and this isn't on any chart. As they approached the cabin, Amos noticed something that made his hand move to his weapon. Fresh blood on the doorframe, still tacky despite the dry air. He motioned for the team to stay back while he and Deputy Hoffman investigated. Inside the cabin was a scene that defied explanation. Modern camping equipment was mixed with what looked like artifacts from the 1800s. Rusted mining tools, old glass bottles, a leather journal that was somehow perfectly preserved. But it was the blood that commanded attention. Splatter patterns on the wall suggested violence, but there was no body. In the corner, they found Blackstone's backpack. His wallet was inside, along with his phone, dead battery, and a handwritten note. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. The guide isn't who he claims to be. I think he's killed before. I'm leaving this in case someone finds it. His real name might be Jacob Forrester. He talks about the old days like he lived them. Says his family has a claim to gold in these mountains. I'm scared. Amos photographed everything, then stepped outside to call for additional resources. This was now a crime scene, possibly a murder scene. He needed forensics, more deputies, and answers about who Jacob Forrester was. While waiting for backup, Tom Rodriguez made a discovery behind the cabin. A mine shaft, partially concealed by brush, descended into the mountain. Fresh rope marks on the wooden beam above it suggested someone had gone down recently. "That's an old shaft," Tom said. "Probably from the 1890s based on the construction. These mountains are riddled with them. Most are played out or too dangerous to explore." Amos shone his flashlight down the shaft. It went down about 30 feet before opening into what looked like a horizontal tunnel. There were fresh scuff marks on the walls. Someone had definitely been down there recently. "We need proper equipment before anyone goes down there," Amos decided. "Cave rescue team, air quality monitors, the works." As they were setting up a perimeter around the cabin, one of the search team members called out. He'd found something in the rocks above the basin. A man's shirt, torn and bloody, caught on a thorny bush. It matched the description of what Blackstone had been wearing. The blood was type O positive, which matched Blackstone's medical records, but the amount suggested injury, not death. Wherever Blackstone was, he might still be alive. As the sun reached its zenith, baking the desert at 115 degrees, more deputies arrived along with a forensics team. The cabin yielded more mysteries than answers. The old artifacts were genuine antiques, some potentially valuable. The journal, written in faded ink, described gold mining operations from 1893 and mentioned a family named Forrester, who'd claimed several mines in the area. But it was the modern equipment that was most disturbing. Along with Blackstone's gear, they found items belonging to at least 3 other people. Driver's licenses, credit cards, phones. A quick check revealed all 3 were hikers who'd gone missing in the Superstitions over the past 2 years, their bodies never found. "We're not looking for just one missing hiker," Amos told his team. "We're looking at a serial killer who's been operating in these mountains." The cave rescue team arrived by late afternoon, equipped with rappelling gear, gas detectors, and communications equipment. The lead climber, Sarah, was one of the best in the state, having pulled dozens of people from Arizona's extensive cave systems. "Air quality is good," she reported after initial readings. "But this shaft connects to a larger system. I can feel air movement from below, which means there are other entrances." Sarah descended first, with Deputy Hoffman following. Their helmet cameras transmitted grainy footage to monitors above. The shaft opened into a tunnel that had been carved by miners over a century ago, but someone had been maintaining it. The support beams were reinforced, the floor cleared of debris. 30 feet into the tunnel, they found blood. A lot of it. The trail led deeper into the mountain. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "There are cells down here, like a prison." The video feed showed 3 chambers carved into the rock, each with a modern padlock on a reinforced door. 2 were empty, but the third... "There's someone in here," Sarah shouted. They broke the lock and found a man, alive but barely conscious, chained to the wall. It wasn't Jeremiah Blackstone. According to the ID in his pocket, this was Mitchell Harper, a hiker who'd been missing for 3 weeks. As the rescue team worked to extract Harper, Amos studied the main tunnel. It continued deeper into the mountain, branching into multiple passages. Somewhere in that labyrinth was Jeremiah Blackstone, and probably the man who'd been hunting hikers in these mountains for years. A sound echoed from deep in the tunnel system, a gunshot, followed by a scream that was definitely human. "Blackstone's alive," Amos said, "and he's in trouble." Sheriff Amos Claiborne made a quick decision. "Sarah, get Harper to the surface immediately. Marcus, call for SWAT and emergency medical. Everyone else, establish a perimeter. Nobody goes deeper into those tunnels until we have tactical support." But even as he gave the orders, another scream echoed from below, weaker this time. Blackstone didn't have time for them, to wait for backup. "Tom," Amos said to the veteran tracker, "you know these mountains better than anyone. Is there another entrance to this mine system?" Tom studied the mountainside, his eyes tracking the geology. "If this connects to the old Dutchman workings, there might be an entrance on the north face, about half a mile from here. It was sealed in the 1940s after some kids died exploring it, but seals can be broken." While the rescue team extracted Harper, Amos took Deputy Hoffman and 2 volunteers to check the north face. They found the sealed entrance Tom had described, but the steel grate that should have covered it had been cut away with bolt cutters. Fresh tool marks suggested it had been opened recently, maybe within the last few days. The opening exhaled cool air that carried the musty smell of deep earth and something else, the copper scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Someone had been shooting inside the mine recently. "This is insane," Hoffman said. "We should wait for backup." "Every minute we wait could be Blackstone's last," Amos replied. He made another command decision. "I'm going in. You coordinate from here." "Sheriff, that's an order, Deputy." Amos checked his equipment. Flashlight, backup flashlight, weapon, radio, first aid kit. He'd been in dangerous situations before, but entering an unmapped mine system alone, pursuing a killer who knew the terrain, was perhaps the most reckless thing he'd done in his career. The tunnel beyond the entrance was different from the shaft they'd found at the cabin. This was older, carved by hand rather than blasted, following a natural vein in the rock. Mining equipment from different eras littered the passage, some from the 1890s, some from the 1940s, and disturbingly, some that looked brand new. About 100 feet in, Amos found the first body. It wasn't Blackstone. The corpse was desiccated, mummified by the dry desert air, wearing clothes that looked decades old. A wallet in the pocket identified him as Robert Henley, reported missing in 1987. He'd been shot in the back, the exit wound still visible in his preserved flesh. This killer had been operating for at least 35 years. Amos photographed the scene and continued deeper. The tunnel branched multiple times, but fresh scuff marks in the dust showed which path had been used recently. He followed them, trying to move quietly despite the crunch of gravel under his boots. 20 minutes into the mine, following a twisting path that seemed to spiral deeper into the mountain, he heard voices. One was pleading, desperate. The other was calm, almost conversational. "You don't understand," the calm voice said. "This mountain belongs to my family. Has for 5 generations. Every person who comes here to steal our gold, to desecrate our claim, they pay the price." "I wasn't looking for gold." That was Blackstone's voice, weak but alive. "I just wanted to hike, to get away from the city. Please, I have a family." "They all say that. They all lie. My great-great-grandfather, Josiah Forrester, found the mother lode in 1891. Millions in gold hidden in these tunnels. The government tried to steal it, said the claim wasn't valid. So we protected it. We've always protected it." Amos crept closer. following the voices through a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. He peered around the corner and saw them. Jeremiah Blackstone was on his knees, hands zip-tied behind his back, blood covering the left side of his face from a head wound. Standing over him was a man who looked to be in his 50s, gaunt and wild-eyed, holding an old revolver. This had to be Jacob Forrester, but there was something off about Forrester. His clothes were an odd mix of modern and antique, as if he'd been raiding the wardrobes of his victims across decades. His hair was long and unkempt, his skin pale from too much time underground. He looked like someone who'd been living in these tunnels for years. "The guide thing works well," Forrester continued, gesturing with the gun. "People trust a local guide. They follow eagerly, thinking they're getting the inside track to hidden treasures or secret trails. But they're all thieves, every one of them." "I hired you through a website," Blackstone said. "desertadventures.com. You had reviews, references." Forrester laughed, a sound that echoed off the cave walls. "Amazing what you can fake online. Create a few accounts, write your own reviews, use photos from real guide services. People are so trusting." Amos needed to act, but Forrester was too far from cover, and any shot would be risky with Blackstone so close. He needed a distraction. His radio, turned low, suddenly crackled with static. It was barely audible, but in the quiet of the cave, Forrester heard it. He spun toward the passage where Amos was hidden. "Who's there? Show yourself or I kill him now." Amos had no choice. He stepped out, weapon drawn but pointed down. "Jacob Forrester, I'm Sheriff Claiborne. Put the weapon down and let's talk about this." Forrester's face contorted with rage. "You brought the law here? To steal our gold?" He pressed the gun to Blackstone's head. "Back off, or he dies. Jacob, I know about your family's claim. I know about the gold. We're not here for that. We just want Mr." Blackstone returned safely. "Lies. That's what they said in 1947 when they killed my grandfather. Said they just wanted to survey the land, but they were trying to steal everything." Amos noticed something Forrester hadn't. Blackstone had been working on his zip ties and one hand was almost free. The banker might have been soft, but he was smart and determined. "Tell me about the gold, Jacob. Tell me about your family's claim." Forrester's eyes lit up with manic pride. "Josiah found the vein following an Apache map. Millions in raw gold waiting to be extracted. But the government said the claim was invalid, that the land belonged to the state. We've been protecting it ever since, keeping out the thieves and claim jumpers. How many people have you killed to protect it? I don't kill them all. Some, like that man your people found, I keep for a while. Try to make them understand. But they never do. They're all corrupted by greed." Behind Forrester, Blackstone got his hand free. He was waiting for an opportunity. "Jacob, there's no gold here," Amos said carefully. "The geological surveys—" "Lies!" Forrester screamed. "I've seen it. My father showed me, his father showed him. It's hidden, deeper than anyone has gone except us." He was becoming more agitated, the gun shaking in his hand. That's when Blackstone made his move, rolling away from Forrester and toward a pile of rocks. Forrester swung the gun toward him and fired, the bullet sparking off stone inches from Blackstone's head. Amos didn't hesitate. His shot took Forrester in the shoulder, spinning him around. The revolver flew from his hand, clattering across the cave floor. Forrester went down, clutching his wound, screaming incoherently about thieves and gold and family honor. "You okay?" Amos asked Blackstone while keeping his weapon trained on Forrester. "I think so, thank you. I thought I was dead for sure." Amos radioed for medical support and backup to enter through the north entrance. Within 20 minutes, the cave was swarming with deputies and EMTs. Forrester was stabilized and extracted, still ranting about protecting his family's legacy. Blackstone was treated for his injuries, a concussion, dehydration, and various cuts and bruises, but nothing life-threatening. The full search of the mine system took 3 days and yielded horrific discoveries. They found the remains of 17 people, some dating back to the 1970s. Each had been killed in the tunnels, their bodies hidden in various chambers and side passages. The oldest victim they could identify was from 1973, suggesting either Jacob or his father had been killing for nearly 50 years. They also found Forrester's living quarters, a series of chambers he'd converted into an underground home. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about missing hikers, maps of the superstitions with marked territories, and hundreds of pages of rambling text about protecting the family claim. But they never found any gold. The geological survey team brought in to examine the mine confirmed what government records from the 1940s had stated. There was no significant gold deposit in this part of the superstitions. The Forrester family had been protecting an illusion for over a century, killing people for treasure that didn't exist. Mitchell Harper, the hiker they'd rescued from the cell, recovered enough to provide crucial testimony. Forrester had kept him alive, trying to convert him to his cause, making him read journals and documents about the family claim. Harper described a man completely detached from reality, living in a fantasy constructed by generations of delusion. He genuinely believed it, Harper told Amos during his interview. The gold, the conspiracy, all of it. He said his father had raised him in those tunnels, teaching him to be the guardian of their legacy. He's never really lived in the real world. The investigation revealed that Jacob Forrester had indeed been maintaining fake guide service websites, using them to lure victims into the mountains. He'd choose people who were traveling alone, who wouldn't be immediately missed. The 3 men, whose belongings they'd found in the cabin, had all hired him through these sites. Forrester's real identity was confirmed through DNA testing. He was indeed descended from Josiah Forrester, who had filed a gold claim in 1891. But records showed Josiah had been a con man, selling shares in his non-existent mine to gullible investors back east. The family had been living a lie for 5 generations, and that lie had cost at least 17 people their lives. The case made national news. The gold ghost of the superstitions, as the media dubbed Forrester, became a symbol of how isolation and delusion could create monsters. Psychological evaluations revealed he suffered from a complex delusional disorder, reinforced by generations of family mythology. Guide Ephraim Dutton, the convicted killer whose name Forrester had been using, was interviewed in prison. He claimed no knowledge of Forrester but wasn't surprised someone had appropriated his identity. "Those mountains make people crazy," Dutton said. "The heat, the isolation, the legends of gold. I spent years in those hills, and I saw things that weren't there, believed things that weren't true. The desert can break your mind if you let it." The Maricopa County Jail's interview room was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the desert heat outside. Sheriff Amos Claiborne sat across from Jacob Forrester, who was shackled to the table, his shoulder still bandaged from the gunshot wound. Forrester's court-appointed attorney, Lisa, sat beside him, but Forrester had insisted on talking despite her advice to remain silent. "You want to understand," Forrester said, his pale eyes fixed on Amos. "But you can't. You've never had a legacy to protect, a sacred duty passed down through blood. Help me understand, Jacob. Your father, was he the one who started the killing?" Forrester shook his head slowly. "My grandfather, Elias. He came back from Korea changed, paranoid. He'd seen what people would do for gold in the war: betrayal, murder, torture. He said we had to protect the claim at all costs. He taught my father taught me. Where's your father now? Dead. Cave-in in 2003. We buried him in the deep chambers with the others who understood. Forrester's eyes went distant. He was the last one who'd actually seen the gold. He promised to show me when I was ready, but he died before I proved myself worthy. Amos leaned forward. Jacob, we've searched every inch of those tunnels. There's no gold, there never was. For the first time, Forrester's composure cracked. His face contorted with rage. Liar! My family didn't die for nothing. Those people didn't die for nothing. Lisa intervened. That's enough for today, Sheriff. As Amos left the jail, his phone rang. It was Tom Rodriguez, the tracker who'd helped find Blackstone. Sheriff, you need to come back to the mountains. We found something you missed. 2 hours later, Amos stood with Tom at a section of the mine they'd already searched. Tom had brought ultrasound equipment normally used for geological surveys. I've been thinking about Forrester's conviction that there was gold, Tom explained. What if there was something down here, just not what he thought? He activated the ultrasound, revealing a cavity behind what appeared to be solid rock. This wall is artificial, Sheriff. Someone sealed this passage, probably decades ago. It took a demolition team 3 hours to safely breach the wall. What they found beyond defied all expectations. The chamber was vast, carved from solid rock with tools and techniques that seemed impossible for 1890s miners. But it wasn't gold that filled the space. It was artifacts. Native American artifacts, thousands of them. Some appearing to be centuries old. Pottery, weapons, ceremonial items, and in the center, a massive stone tablet covered with petroglyphs. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Arizona State University's anthropology department arrived the next morning. Her assessment was stunning. This is a Apache sacred site, probably used for centuries before European contact. These artifacts. Sheriff, this collection is priceless. Museum quality. Some of these pieces are completely unique to archaeological record. So there was treasure in the mountain, Amos said quietly. Yes, but not gold. Cultural treasure. The Forrester family built their mine right through an ancient sacred site. They probably found this chamber early on, sealed it to hide the evidence of what they'd destroyed and stolen. The revelation changed everything about the case. The Apache Nation was notified and immediately claimed ownership of the site and artifacts. The federal government got involved, as disturbing Native American sacred sites was a federal crime. Jeremiah Blackstone, recovering in a Phoenix hospital, asked to see Amos. The investment banker looked different. The near-death experience had clearly affected him profoundly. I need to tell you something, Blackstone said. Forrester, he showed me things in the tunnels before you found us. Papers, old documents. His family wasn't just protecting imaginary gold. They were hiding evidence of what they'd done to the Apache people who used to live in those mountains. He handed Amos a photograph he'd managed to hide during his captivity. It was old, dating from the 1890s, showing Josiah Forrester and several other men standing over the bodies of Native Americans at what was clearly the mine entrance. He bragged about it, Blackstone continued. Said his great-great-grandfather had cleared out the savages to stake his claim. There were records of a massacre that was covered up, blamed on Mexican bandits. The Forresters have been hiding that crime for over a century. The investigation expanded again. Historians were brought in to examine the evidence. They discovered that in 1891, an entire Apache band, about 30 people, had disappeared from the Superstition Mountains. The official record blamed Mexican raiders, but now it seemed the Forrester family and their associates had murdered them to steal their sacred site. Jacob Forrester was brought back for questioning. When confronted with the evidence of the massacre in the sacred site, his delusions finally began to crack. "My father said we were protecting our rightful claim," he said, his voice small and broken. "He said the Indians had shown Josiah where the gold was, then tried to take it back. But there was no gold, was there? Just the things we stole from the people we killed. Your family has been living a lie for 5 generations, Jacob, and that lie has cost dozens of lives." Forrester broke down completely, sobbing. "I killed those people for nothing. For a lie built on murder and theft. Oh God, what have I done?" The psychiatric evaluation was updated. Forrester wasn't just delusional. He was the product of generational trauma and lies, raised in isolation with a worldview built entirely on false premises and hidden crimes. His entire identity had been constructed around protecting a secret that was itself a cover-up for genocide. The case took another turn when one of the surviving victims, Mitchell Harper, revealed more about his captivity. "Forrester had help," Harper told Amos. "There was someone else who brought supplies, someone he called cousin. I never saw them clearly, but I heard them talking. This cousin was trying to convince Forrester to stop, to leave the mountains." A search of records revealed that Jacob Forrester had a cousin, Samuel Forrester, who lived in Tucson. When questioned, Samuel broke down immediately. "I've been trying to get Jacob help for years," Samuel said. "Our family is cursed by what happened in those mountains. My father broke away from it, moved to the city, tried to live a normal life. But Jacob's father, Uncle Marcus, he stayed in the mountains, raised Jacob in those tunnels like some kind of feral child. You knew about the murders? I suspected. When hikers went missing, I wondered. But Jacob was family and he was sick. I brought him food, supplies, tried to convince him to leave. I thought if I could get him away from those tunnels, maybe he could get better." Samuel was arrested as an accessory after the fact. His cooperation helped investigators understand the full scope of the Forrester family's activities. He provided journals and documents that had been passed down through his side of the family, revealing that multiple generations had known about both the massacre and the subsequent murders, but had kept silent out of family loyalty and fear. The Apache Nation held a ceremony at the sacred site, blessing the recovered artifacts and the spirits of their ancestors who had been killed there. Tribal elder Joseph Yazzie spoke to Amos after the ceremony. "The mountain holds many secrets, Sheriff. Our people always knew something dark had happened here, but the truth was hidden. Now, at least, our ancestors can rest, and their sacred items can return to the people." The trial of Jacob Forrester became a sensation. The media dubbed it the Treasure of Lies case. Forrester was ultimately found guilty but mentally ill, sentenced to life in a secure psychiatric facility rather than regular prison. The judge noted that while Forrester was responsible for his actions, he was also a victim of generational delusion and abuse. "Mr. Forrester was raised in a false reality," the judge said during sentencing. "Isolated, indoctrinated, and trained from childhood to be a killer in service of a lie. This doesn't excuse his crimes, but it explains them. He is both perpetrator and victim." Jeremiah Blackstone used his experience to establish a foundation for missing hiker cases, funding advanced search and rescue equipment for Arizona's sheriff departments. He also worked with tech companies to develop apps that could verify the legitimacy of wilderness guides and tour operators. "I was lucky," Blackstone told reporters. "Sheriff Claiborne saved my life, but 17 others weren't so fortunate. If my experience can prevent even one person from falling into a similar trap, then something good will have come from this nightmare." The Superstition Mountain's reputation as a dangerous and mysterious place only grew after the Forrester case. But now there were new safety protocols. Guided tours required, verification, solo hikers were encouraged to use GPS trackers, and the old mine entrances were systematically mapped and sealed. Tom Rodriguez, the tracker who'd helped crack the case, became the official liaison between law enforcement and the hiking community. He developed a program to train hikers on danger signs and how to verify legitimate guides. The mountains aren't evil, Tom told a group of hikers during a safety seminar. But they're unforgiving, and they attract people who think isolation means they can live by their own rules. Stay alert, stay together, and always tell someone where you're going. 6 months after the arrest, Amos received a letter from Jacob Forrester. The medication and therapy in the psychiatric facility had brought some clarity to his mind. Sheriff Claiborne, the letter read, "I remember them all now. Every person I killed. I remember their faces, their pleas, their families they told me about. The doctors say I was insane, that I couldn't fully understand what I was doing. But I understood enough. I knew I was taking lives. I justified it with lies, but part of me always knew. I'm writing to ask not for forgiveness. I don't deserve that, but to tell you where the others are, the ones you haven't found yet. I kept records hidden in the tunnels. 3rd chamber from the north entrance behind the quartz formation. 12 more names, 12 more families who deserve closure. I was the last of the Forrester Guardians. Let me at least be the one who finally tells the truth." The information led to the recovery of 12 more victims, some dating back to the 1970s. Each family was notified, each victim properly buried. The total count of the Forrester family's victims over generations was estimated at nearly 40 people. Amos stood once more at the sealed entrance to the mine system, watching as the final concrete barrier was put in place. The Apache Nation had reclaimed their sacred site. The victims had been found and returned to their families, and the Forrester legacy of violence had finally ended. "Think it's over?" Deputy Marcus Hoffman asked, standing beside him. "This is," Amos replied, "but these mountains have more secrets. They always have." As they drove away, Amos looked back at the Superstition Mountains, their peaks painted gold by the setting sun. Beautiful and deadly, they stood as they had for millions of years, indifferent to human ambition and madness. The Forrester mine was sealed, but other dangers lurked in those ancient rocks. Other mysteries waited to be discovered. The desert kept its secrets, sometimes for generations. But eventually, truth had a way of surfacing, like bones after a flash flood, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding justice. 1 year after Jacob Forrester's arrest, Sheriff Amos Claiborne was preparing for retirement. At 62, he'd given the badge everything he had, and the Forrester case had taken a toll that went beyond physical exhaustion. But the universe had one more twist waiting for him. The call came on a quiet Tuesday morning. A group of ASU geology students had been mapping the sealed mine entrances as part of a safety survey when their equipment detected something unusual: air movement from what should have been a completely sealed system. "Sheriff, there's another entrance, Doctor," Patricia Wells from the geology department explained. "One that's not on any of our maps, and it's been used recently." Amos met the team at a location 2 miles from the original Forrester mine complex. Hidden behind a natural rockfall was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Fresh scratches on the rocks and disturbed vegetation suggested someone had been using it within the past few weeks. "This shouldn't exist," Tom Rodriguez said, studying the entrance. "I've mapped every inch of these mountains." Deputy Marcus Hoffman had brought thermal imaging equipment. "I'm reading a heat signature about 50 yards in, Sheriff. It's human-sized and moving." Amos felt his retirement slipping away. "Set up a perimeter. Nobody goes in until we know what we're dealing with." They didn't have to wait long. 3 hours into their watch, a figure emerged from the opening. A woman, elderly, dressed in clothes that looked handmade from various fabrics. She saw the officers and tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Claiborne. We need you to come out slowly with your hands visible." The woman emerged fully, and Amos got his first clear look at her. She appeared to be in her 70s, with long gray hair and the kind of deep tan that came from years in the desert sun. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and deeply sad. "You're him," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. "The one who caught Jacob. Who are you?" "Martha Forrester, Jacob's aunt, Marcus's sister." She looked at the officers surrounding her. "I suppose it's time for the last secret to come out." At the station, Martha's story unfolded like something from another era. She'd been living in the tunnels for 40 years, hiding from the world and from her family's crimes. "I was 28 when I learned what my father and brother were doing," she explained, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her first in decades. "Killing hikers, perpetuating grandfather's lies. I tried to stop them, tried to go to the police, but my father, he locked me in the deep tunnels, said I was a traitor to the family, that I'd die down there as punishment." "You've been living in the mines for 40 years?" Amos asked, incredulous. "Not continuously." "I found another way out after a few months, but by then, everyone thought I was dead. My father had told everyone I'd run off to California. I couldn't prove what they'd done, had no evidence, and who'd believe someone who'd been living in tunnels? So, I became a ghost, living on the edges, watching." "Watching what?" Martha's expression darkened. "Watching my brother raise Jacob in madness, watching them kill, recording everything in journals, hoping someday I'd have the courage to come forward. But I was a coward. Every person they killed I could have prevented if I'd just been brave enough to speak up." She directed them to her living space in the unmapped section of the mine, a surprisingly comfortable chamber she'd furnished with items salvaged or stolen over the decades. But it was her collection of journals that proved most valuable. 40 years of observations, meticulously documenting the Forrester family's crimes. "There are more bodies," she said quietly, "ones Jacob didn't know about. My father and brother's victims from before Jacob was old enough to participate. I marked their locations. Her maps led to the recovery of 8 more victims, dating from the 1960s and 70s. Each discovery added another layer to the horrific legacy of the Forrester family. But Martha had more to reveal. The massacre in 1891, it wasn't just Josiah. There were 5 other families involved. Some of their descendants are still prominent in Arizona. The Weatherbys, the Cranstons, the Delacours, the Medinas, and the Grants. They all participated, all profited from the stolen Apache artifacts that were sold to private collectors. This revelation sent shockwaves through Arizona society. The families she named included a state senator, a federal judge, and 3 prominent business owners. The investigation expanded yet again, now reaching into the highest levels of state power. Federal investigators found evidence supporting Martha's claims. Several of the Apache artifacts found in the sacred chamber matched items in the private collections of the named families. Documentation was uncovered showing secret sales of Indian relics dating back to the 1890s. State Senator William Weatherby held a press conference denying any knowledge of his family's involvement. But when presented with a photograph from his own family album showing his great-grandfather with Josiah Forrester at the massacre site, he was forced to resign. Judge Helen Cranston recused herself from all pending cases and announced her retirement. The Delacour family's construction empire faced boycotts and protests. The Medina family's ranch was revealed to be built on stolen Apache land. The Grants liquidated their assets and left the state entirely. Jacob Forrester, watching the news from his psychiatric facility, had another breakdown. "It wasn't just us," he kept repeating. "The whole foundation of this place is built on blood and lies." Martha Forrester was charged as an accessory after the fact for not reporting the crimes she'd witnessed. But given her circumstances, essentially held captive, threatened, and living in fear for decades, the prosecutor recommended probation and community service. At her sentencing, Martha addressed the court, "I've lived with the weight of my silence for 40 years. Every victim my family claimed I could have saved if I'd been braver. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just for the chance to spend whatever years I have left trying to make amends." She was sentenced to 5 years probation and 3,000 hours of community service, which she chose to fulfill by helping map the dangerous mine shafts throughout Arizona and working with the Apache Nation to document their oral histories. The Apache Nation used the evidence Martha provided to file federal lawsuits against the descendant families and the state of Arizona. The settlements, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, funded education and cultural preservation programs for the tribe. Elder Joseph Yazzie met with Martha privately. "You were a victim too," he told her, "trapped by your family's evil just as our ancestors were. Your speaking truth now, even so late, honors their memory." Jeremiah Blackstone, the hiker whose near death had started the unraveling of the conspiracy, wrote a book about his experience. All proceeds went to victims' families and Apache cultural programs. He met with Martha once, a meeting that both described as necessary but painful. "I hated you at first," Blackstone told her. "You could have prevented what happened to me, to all of us. But then I realized you were as much a prisoner as I was, just for longer." Sheriff Amos Claiborne finally retired 6 months after Martha's emergence. His last official act was overseeing the complete sealing of the Forrester mine complex with concrete and steel, ensuring no one could ever enter again. The Apache Nation performed a final ceremony, blessing the site and laying the spirits to rest. At his retirement ceremony, Amos reflected on the case that had defined the end of his career. "The Forrester case taught me that evil can be generational, passed down like a poisoned inheritance. But it also taught me that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. And when it does, we have a choice: to face it with courage or let it fester in darkness." Tom Rodriguez took over the expanded safety program for the Superstition Mountains. Using Martha's detailed knowledge and maps, they identified and sealed dozens of dangerous abandoned mines. The death rate for hikers dropped by 60% in the first year. Deputy Marcus Hoffman was elected sheriff, promising to continue Amos's work of uncovering cold cases and bringing justice to forgotten victims. One of his first acts was establishing a cold case unit specifically for missing hikers and unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas. Martha Forrester spent her remaining years living in a small apartment in Phoenix, working tirelessly to document everything she knew about the crimes and the cover-ups. She testified in multiple trials, helped locate more victims, and became an unexpected advocate for mental health services for isolated communities. "Isolation breeds madness," she said in one of her final interviews. "My family lived in those mountains, in those tunnels, in their own minds. Each generation's delusions fed the next. If someone had intervened earlier, shown them reality, maybe none of this would have happened." She died peacefully in her sleep at age 76, having spent her last years trying to atone for decades of silence. Her journals were donated to the Arizona Historical Society, a permanent record of how lies and violence can perpetuate through generations when good people stay silent. Jacob Forrester outlived his aunt by only 3 months. He died in the psychiatric facility, reportedly of natural causes, though staff said he'd simply given up the will to live after learning the full extent of his family's crimes and the lies he'd been raised on. His final words, according to his psychiatrist, were, "There was never any gold. There was never any honor. Just murder built on murder, lies built on lies. I was the guardian of nothing. The superstition mountains stand unchanged, ancient and indifferent to human drama. The trails remain popular with hikers, though now with better safety measures and verified guide services. The sealed mines are monitored by sensors that detect any attempted breaches. But locals say that on certain nights, when the wind blows just right through the canyons, you can still hear echoes from the sealed tunnels. Not supernatural, just the sound of air moving through spaces that should never have been carved, carrying the memory of crimes that should never have been committed. Sheriff Amos Claiborne, in retirement, occasionally leads educational hikes for law enforcement officers, teaching them about the Forrester case and its lessons. Evil rarely announces itself, he tells them, standing at the overlook where he first saw the ancient cabin that started it all. It hides behind familiar faces, family traditions, and false narratives. Our job is to dig past the lies, no matter how deep they're buried, and bring truth to light, because in the end, truth is the only thing that sets anyone free. The last Forrester secret had been revealed. The last victim had been found. The last lie had been exposed. The mountains had given up their dead, and finally there could be peace. But Amos knew, as all who worked these lands knew, that the desert had more secrets. Other families with hidden crimes. Other tunnels with untold stories. Other victims waiting to be found. The work was never truly done. But for now, for this case, justice had been served. Imperfect, delayed, but final. The Forrester legacy of violence had ended, and from its ashes, truth had emerged, burning away generations of lies in the harsh, purifying light of the Arizona sun. Sheriff Jasper Thorndike had mediated dozens of property disputes in his 19 years serving Yavapai County, but the call that came in on that sweltering July morning would lead him into the most disturbing case of his career. At 53, his weathered hands and sun-creased face bore witness to nearly 2 decades of keeping peace in Arizona's high desert, where property lines meant everything and neighbors could harbor grudges for generations. The complaint came from farmer Zechariah Bramwell, whose family had worked 600 acres of irrigated land near the Verde River for 4 generations. His voice over the phone was steady but concerned, unusual for a man who'd weathered droughts, floods, and market crashes without complaint. "Sheriff Thorndike, I need you to come out to my property. My neighbor, Cornelius Ashworth, he's done something to his land. My cattle won't go near our shared fence line anymore. They just stand there, 30 feet back, bellowing like they're terrified." Jasper knew both families well. The Bramwells were salt-of-the-earth farming people, practical and level-headed. The Ashworths had owned the adjacent property for just as long, but Cornelius had only recently returned after his father's death, inheriting 800 acres of mostly undeveloped desert land. The drive out to the Bramwell farm took Jasper through some of the most beautiful high-desert country in Arizona. The July heat was oppressive even at 8 in the morning, but the monsoon season was approaching, promising relief in the form of violent afternoon thunderstorms. He found Zechariah waiting at the edge of his property, standing by his old Ford pickup. At 68, Zechariah still worked his land every day, his calloused hands and straight posture testament to a lifetime of hard labor. "Thanks for coming, Sheriff. I know this sounds like a minor complaint, but something's not right over there." Jasper looked across the fence line to the Ashworth property. The land looked normal enough. Desert scrub, Joshua trees, and in the distance, the old Ashworth ranch house that had been built in the 1920s. But Zechariah was right about the cattle. A small herd stood unnaturally far from the fence, clustered together despite the heat. When did this start? About 2 weeks ago, right after Cornelius started his improvements. He said he was going to develop the land, maybe put in some sustainable agriculture, solar panels, that sort of thing. But Sheriff, I've been farming this land for 40 years. I know every sound, every smell. What's coming from his property ain't natural. What exactly are you sensing? Zechariah struggled to find words. At night, there's sounds. Not machinery, not animals. It's like singing, but not quite. And the smell when the wind shifts, it's sweet and rotten at the same time, like overripe fruit mixed with something dead. They walked along the fence line, and Jasper noticed something odd. Every 50 feet or so, Cornelius had installed what looked like irrigation pipes, but they were pointed horizontally toward the Bramwell property rather than down at the ground. "Those are new," Zechariah said. "Put them in last week. Told me they were for a misting system for his crops, but Sheriff, he ain't planted nothing." A distant sound made them both turn. Someone was approaching on an ATV from the Ashworth property. As the vehicle got closer, Jasper recognized Cornelius Ashworth, though he'd changed significantly since Jasper had last seen him at his father's funeral 6 months ago. Once a robust man in his 50s, Cornelius had lost considerable weight. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his skin had an unhealthy grayish pallor despite the desert sun. But it was his eyes that disturbed Jasper most. They were bright, almost feverish, with the intensity of someone who'd been awake for days. "Sheriff Thorndyke, Mr. Bramwell," Cornelius said, his voice hoarse. "I suppose you're here about the cattle. Zechariah's concerned about some unusual activity on your property, Cornelius." Cornelius smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm conducting agricultural experiments, completely legal. I have all the permits from the county. What kind of experiments require those?" Jasper pointed to the horizontal pipes. "Pheromone dispersal. I'm testing natural methods to keep pests away from crops. The cattle are responding to the scent markers. They'll adjust in a few weeks." It was a plausible explanation, but something in Cornelius's manner set off Jasper's instincts. The man kept glancing back toward his property, as if worried about leaving it unattended. "Mind if I take a look at these permits?" Jasper asked. "They're at the house. You're welcome to stop by tomorrow during business hours. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have time-sensitive work to attend to." As Cornelius drove away, Jasper noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, the ranch house looked normal from the outside, but the moment they entered, they were hit by that smell Zechariah had described, sickeningly sweet, with an undertone of decay. The living room had been converted into a makeshift laboratory, with tables covered in beakers, microscopes, and equipment Jasper didn't recognize. But it was the back room that revealed the true horror. Behind a door marked storage was a refrigerated room containing rows of glass containers. Each held tissue samples, organs, and other biological material that was clearly human. Labels on the containers bore dates and what appeared to be initials. "What the hell is this?" Deputy Pike demanded, her hand on her weapon. Cornelius's demeanor shifted from indignant to eerily calm. "Specimens. For my research. Human specimens? Where did these come from?" "Volunteers, people who understood the importance of my work. Where are these volunteers now?" Cornelius smiled that unsettling smile again. "They've contributed all they could to science." Jasper arrested him on the spot for suspicion of murder. But Cornelius seemed unconcerned, almost amused. As they were taking him to the patrol car, he said something that chilled Jasper to the bone. "You think you're stopping me, but the work is already done. The seeds are planted. In a few days, you'll understand. Everyone will understand." A thorough search of the property revealed horrors beyond imagination. In an old barn, they found 3 shallow graves containing the remains of the missing persons. But these weren't simple murders. The bodies showed signs of systematic dissection, organ removal, and what the medical examiner would later describe as experimental procedures consistent with unauthorized human testing. In Cornelius's laboratory notebooks, written in meticulous detail, was his plan. He'd been developing what he called a biological deterrent system, essentially a weaponized pheromone that would cause intense fear and eventual organ failure in any mammal exposed to it for extended periods. His target had been specific: the Bramwell family. Deeper investigation revealed that Cornelius believed the Bramwells had stolen water rights from his family decades ago, rights that had cost the Ashworths millions in potential agricultural development. His father had let it go, but Cornelius had nursed the grudge, planning his revenge while working in pharmaceutical research. He was going to poison them, Deputy Marcus said, reading through the notebooks. Slowly, through airborne chemicals that would look like natural illness. The cattle were just the test run, but there was more. The final entries in Cornelius's journal suggested he'd already implemented part of his plan. Those horizontal pipes weren't just pointing at the Bramwell property. They were connected to an underground dispersal system that ran beneath both properties. "Get everyone evacuated now," Jasper ordered. "The Bramwell family, their workers, everyone within a mile radius." As evacuation began, they discovered that Cornelius had installed the underground system weeks ago, during the night, using his knowledge of the property lines and old surveys to place the pipes exactly where they needed to be. The system was timer-activated, set to release its contents in stages. The evacuation of the Bramwell farm proceeded with urgent efficiency. Zechariah, his wife Ruth, their 3 adult children, and 7 farm workers were moved to temporary housing in Prescott. The cattle were transported to a neighboring ranch 20 miles away. But even as they worked, Jasper knew they were racing against an unknown clock. Cornelius Ashworth sat in the interrogation room at the county jail, completely calm despite facing multiple murder charges. His attorney, a high-priced lawyer from Phoenix named Gregory Steinberg, had advised him to remain silent, but Cornelius seemed eager to talk. "You don't understand the elegance of it," Cornelius said, his eyes bright with fanatic fervor. "Targeted biological warfare at the molecular level. The compounds I developed bond with specific genetic markers. I could eliminate an entire family line while leaving everyone else unharmed. You murdered 3 innocent people to test your poison," Jasper said flatly. "Sacrifices for science. Those men were drifters, contributing nothing to society. Their deaths served a greater purpose." Cornelius leaned forward. "The Bramwells destroyed my family. My grandfather had legal water rights from 1923, but the Bramwells bribed a judge in 1962 to transfer them. My father spent his entire inheritance fighting it in court and lost. We had to sell half our land to pay legal fees. So you decided to commit genocide?" "Justice," Cornelius corrected. "Delayed, but inevitable." The interrogation was interrupted by Deputy Eleanor Pike. "Sheriff, we have a problem." The hazmat team found something. The hazmat team, brought in from Phoenix, had been examining the underground dispersal system. What they'd discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. The system wasn't just under the Ashworth and Bramwell properties. It extended for miles, following the old irrigation channels that dated back to the 1920s. He's been at this for months, the team leader, Captain Roberto Sanchez, explained. This isn't just about the Bramwells. The system could contaminate the entire Verde River watershed. We're talking about potential exposure for thousands of people. Can you stop it? We're trying to trace all the pipes, but it's extensive. And Sheriff, we found something else. There are timer mechanisms at various points, all set to release at different times over the next 72 hours. If we miss even one. Jasper returned to Cornelius with new urgency. Tell us how to disable the system. Innocent people will die. Cornelius smiled. Innocent? Nobody in this county is innocent. The Weatherbys took native land, the Johnsons polluted the groundwater with their mining. The Prescotts destroyed entire ecosystems with their developments. They all deserve judgment. Including children? There are 3 schools in the potential contamination zone. For the first time, Cornelius's composure cracked slightly. The compounds are designed for specific genetic markers. Children weren't part of the plan. Your plan is flawed, Cornelius. Biological weapons don't discriminate as precisely as you think. Attorney Steinberg intervened. My client will provide information on disabling the system in exchange for certain considerations. He's facing multiple murder charges. There's no deal that takes that off the table. But the death penalty could be, Steinberg suggested. While the lawyers negotiated, Deputy Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. Going through Cornelius's computer files, he found correspondence dating back 2 years with someone identified only as the architect. The messages revealed that Cornelius wasn't working alone. The architect had provided funding, technical specifications, and most disturbingly, a list of target families throughout Arizona. The Bramwells were just the beginning. This is bigger than one man's revenge, Marcus told Jasper. Someone's using Cornelius as a weapon against specific families. Look at this list. They all have one thing in common. They own water rights. Water rights in Arizona were more valuable than gold, determining who could farm, who could develop, and who controlled the state's most precious resource. Someone was trying to eliminate water rights holders to consolidate control. Jasper confronted Cornelius with the evidence. Who is the architect? Cornelius's face went pale. I don't know. I never met them in person. Everything was done through encrypted messages and cryptocurrency payments. You were being used. No. We had aligned interests. They provided resources. I provided expertise. It was a partnership. They were using you to commit murders while they stayed hidden. You're the fall guy, Cornelius. The realization hit Cornelius hard. His carefully constructed justification began to crumble. They said we were bringing justice. They said the families we targeted were criminals who'd escaped legal consequences. Give us everything. Every communication, every payment record, every technical specification. Help us stop this, and maybe you can prevent more deaths. Over the next 24 hours, Cornelius provided detailed information about the dispersal system. Hazmat teams worked around the clock, following his maps to locate and disable timer mechanisms. They found 17 release points, each containing enough biotoxin to contaminate square miles of land. But they also discovered that Cornelius had been more careful than the architect realized. He'd built in a master override, a failsafe he'd kept secret. I'm not a monster, he insisted as he provided the override codes. I wanted justice, not random slaughter. The override was my insurance that only the guilty would suffer. The override worked, shutting down the entire system with hours to spare. But the investigation into the architect continued. The cryptocurrency payments were traced through multiple exchanges and shell companies, eventually leading to a shocking revelation. The money originated from the Harwick Corporation, one of Arizona's largest agricultural conglomerates. CEO Thomas Harwick had been quietly buying water rights for years, but several old families had refused to sell. The FBI found evidence that he'd recruited Cornelius through intermediaries, manipulating the disturbed chemist's desire for revenge to eliminate his business obstacles. The raid on Harwick's Scottsdale mansion was conducted at dawn. They found him attempting to destroy evidence, but FBI computer forensics recovered enough to prove his involvement. His plan had been breathtakingly ruthless. Eliminate water rights holders through seemingly unconnected deaths, then buy the rights from desperate estates at a fraction of their value. Cornelius was perfect, Harwick said during his interrogation, showing no remorse. Brilliant, motivated, and ultimately disposable. If his plan had worked, I'd have controlled water for half the state. If it failed, he'd take the fall alone. You manipulated a mentally disturbed man into committing murders for your profit. I gave him the resources to pursue his revenge. What he did with them was his choice. The trial became a sensation. Cornelius Ashworth was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and attempted mass murder, but his cooperation and clear mental illness resulted in life imprisonment rather than death. He was sent to a secure psychiatric facility where he could receive treatment. Thomas Harwick was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, terrorism, and racketeering. His agricultural empire collapsed, its assets liquidated to pay settlements to the victims' families and fund cleanup of the contamination system. The 3 victims, Jorge Martinez, Robert Sullivan, and Timothy, were revealed to be more than just drifters. Jorge had been a migrant worker sending money home to his family in Mexico. Robert was a veteran, struggling with PTSD, hiking the desert for peace. Timothy was a graduate student researching desert ecosystems. Their families received what comfort justice could provide, though nothing could bring them back. Zechariah Bramwell and his family returned to their farm, but the experience had changed them. They installed new security systems and began testing their water regularly. The cattle eventually returned to grazing near the fence line, but Zechariah said they never fully trusted that area again. "Animals know," he told Jasper months later. "They sense evil in ways we've forgotten how to. Should have listened to them sooner." The investigation revealed that 17 other families across Arizona had been targeted in the architect's plan. Each was warned, and security measures were implemented to protect them. The water rights they held were placed under federal protection to prevent future targeting. Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw from the CDC studied Cornelius's biotoxins and was horrified by their sophistication. "He created weapons that could have destabilized entire ecosystems," she reported. "The knowledge he developed must be classified and controlled. In the wrong hands, it could be catastrophic." Cornelius's laboratory was decontaminated and demolished. The land was tested monthly for 5 years to ensure no trace of the toxins remained. The Ashworth property was eventually sold to the Nature Conservancy, becoming a desert preserve where the dark history could be buried under new growth. But the most disturbing revelation came from Cornelius himself. In a letter he sent to Jasper from the psychiatric facility. "Sheriff Thorndike, I've had time to think, to see past my anger. What I did was wrong, evil even. But the knowledge I developed, the compounds I created, they're out there now. I wasn't the only chemist Harwick approached. There are others, in other states, with other grievances. The Pandora's box of targeted biological weapons is open. What happened in Yavapai County was just the beginning." The FBI took the warning seriously, launching a nationwide investigation into similar plots. They found 3 other cases in development, all following the same pattern. Brilliant, disturbed individuals manipulated by wealthy interests to eliminate obstacles through biological weapons. Each was stopped, but the threat remained. The knowledge existed, the technology was accessible, and there would always be those willing to exploit personal vendettas for profit. 6 months after Cornelius Ashworth's arrest, Sheriff Jasper Thorndike thought the case was closed. The trials were over, the contamination cleaned up, and how life in Yavapai County had returned to normal. But a call from the FBI would prove that the nightmare was far from over. Special Agent Diana Rodriguez arrived at his office on a cold February morning, carrying files marked classified. "Sheriff, we need to discuss what Cornelius Ashworth created. More specifically, who else knows about it?" She spread photographs across his desk. Images from Cornelius's laboratory, but also other locations, labs in New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, all showing similar setups, similar equipment. Thomas Harwick kept records, Rodriguez explained. Encrypted, hidden, but we found them. He didn't just recruit Cornelius. He had a network of what he called assets. Scientists with grudges, brilliant but unstable individuals he could manipulate. How many? 7 that we've identified. 3 we've arrested. 3 disappeared before we could get to them, and 1. She pulled out a photograph of a woman in her 40s, professional-looking but with cold, calculating eyes. Dr. Sarah Kellerman. She was Cornelius's online contact, the one who helped him refine his formulas. She's still out there. Jasper studied the photograph. She was involved in the murders? Indirectly. She provided technical knowledge, knowing what Cornelius intended to do with it. But here's the problem. She was smarter than him. While Cornelius was focused on revenge, she was thinking bigger. She downloaded all his research before we seized his computers. What does she want? Money. She's been selling the formulas on the dark web. 3 buyers so far that we know of, all overseas. But last week she made contact with someone local. Rodriguez showed him intercepted communications. Someone in Arizona was negotiating to buy not just the formulas, but Sarah Kellerman's services. They wanted her to create a new version of Cornelius's biotoxin, one that could be deployed more subtly. The buyer calls himself Prometheus, Rodriguez continued. We've traced the communications to somewhere in Yavapai County. That's why I'm here. We need your help to find him before this deal goes through. Jasper assembled his best deputies, Eleanor Pike and Marcus, for a briefing. They began analyzing the intercepted messages, looking for any clues to Prometheus's identity. It was Deputy Marcus who noticed the pattern. Look at the times of these messages. Always during business hours, never on weekends. And this phrase he uses, water is life, but also death. I've heard that before. It took them 3 days of investigation to identify Prometheus. The clues led to someone they never suspected, Judge William Brennan, a respected member of the community who'd served on the bench for 15 years. That's impossible, Jasper said when Marcus presented his findings. Brennan's been a pillar of law and order. He presided over Cornelius's preliminary hearings, which gave him access to all the evidence, Marcus pointed out. He saw what Cornelius created, understood its potential. Sheriff, Brennan's family lost their ranch in 2008 during the recession. The bank that foreclosed, owned by Thomas Harwick. The pieces fell into place. Brennan had his own grudge against the power structures in Arizona, the wealthy families who'd prospered while others lost everything. He'd seen in Cornelius's weapon a tool for his own version of justice. Surveillance on Judge Brennan began immediately, but they had to be careful. A sitting judge had powerful connections, and one wrong move could destroy the investigation. They watched as he maintained his normal routine: court sessions, golf with colleagues, dinners at the country club. But Deputy Pike noticed something odd. Every Thursday evening, Brennan drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of Prescott. He'd stay for exactly 1 hour, then leave. "We need a warrant for that storage unit," Jasper said. "From which judge?" Pike asked pointedly. "Brennan plays poker with half the judiciary in the state." They decided to wait, to gather more evidence. The decision nearly proved fatal. Dr. Sarah Kellerman arrived in Arizona 3 days later. The FBI had been tracking her, but she was clever, using multiple identities and routes. By the time they realized she was in Prescott, she'd already met with Brennan. The storage unit, when they finally gained emergency access, revealed a fully equipped laboratory, but it was empty of people. Kellerman and Brennan had been tipped off, probably by someone in law enforcement. "We have a leak," Rodriguez said grimly. "Someone's protecting them." The leak was discovered when Deputy Marcus noticed unusual activity on the department's computer system. Someone had been accessing files related to the investigation, someone with high-level clearance. The digital trail led to Captain Howard Morris, Jasper's own superior. Morris had been sheriff before Jasper, stepping down to a less demanding role as he approached retirement. He was also Judge Brennan's brother-in-law. The confrontation happened in Morris's office. The older man didn't deny it when presented with the evidence. "Bill's a good man," Morris said. "He lost everything in 2008 while the criminals who caused the recession got bailouts. You think Cornelius was wrong to want revenge? At least his targets were specific. The real criminals are the ones who destroy thousands of lives with a pen stroke. So, you're helping him commit mass murder? I'm helping him level the playing field." Sarah Kellerman's improved formula wouldn't kill anyone. It would just make them sick, very sick. Sick enough to lose their fortunes paying for treatment, just like ordinary folks lose everything when they get cancer. Jasper arrested Morris on the spot, but the damage was done. Brennan and Kellerman knew they were blown. They'd gone underground. Finding them became a race against time. The FBI believed they had enough biotoxin prepared to contaminate water supplies for several wealthy neighborhoods in Phoenix and Scottsdale. Unlike Cornelius's targeted approach, this would be indiscriminate within those areas. The break came from an unexpected source. Cornelius Ashworth, from his psychiatric facility, contacted Jasper. He'd heard about Kellerman through the patient grapevine. Even in isolation, information traveled. "She's using my work wrong," Cornelius said during a video call. "The formulas she stole, she doesn't understand the stabilization requirements. If she deploys what she's created, it won't just make people sick. It'll mutate, become something uncontrollable. Help us stop her." "I can't from here, but there's something she doesn't know. I built a tracker into the molecular structure of my compounds. Anyone who synthesizes them leaves a chemical signature. You can track where they've been manufactured." Using Cornelius's information, the FBI developed a detection method. They found traces of the chemical signature at 3 locations: the storage unit, an abandoned warehouse in Phoenix, and surprisingly a cabin in the Bradshaw Mountains. The cabin belonged to Judge Brennan's deceased parents. It was isolated, accessible only by a dirt road, perfect for hiding. A drone surveillance confirmed heat signatures inside and chemical equipment in an outbuilding. The raid was planned for dawn. FBI tactical teams, state police, and Jasper's deputies surrounded the property. But as they moved in, they triggered improvised explosive devices Brennan had planted. 3 officers were injured, though none fatally. In the chaos, Kellerman tried to release the biotoxin through an aerosol system. Deputy Eleanor Pike, wearing hazmat gear, managed to shoot the dispersal mechanism before it fully activated. Only a small amount was released, contained within the cabin. Judge Brennan was captured trying to escape through the woods, but Sarah Kellerman had a different plan. She'd ingested a concentrated dose of her own biotoxin, choosing suicide over capture. "You don't understand," she gasped as EMTS tried to save her. This was just the beginning. The knowledge is out there now. Others will perfect it. The age of biological revenge has begun. She died en route to the hospital, her body ravaged by the very weapon she'd created. Judge William Brennan's arrest sent shockwaves through Arizona's legal system. A sitting judge planning biological terrorism was unprecedented. His trial revealed the depth of his hatred for the financial systems that had destroyed his family's legacy. "They took everything," he said during his allocution. "My family's ranch, built over 3 generations, gone because of predatory lending and rigged markets. The law I swore to uphold protected them, not us. I wanted them to feel what it's like to lose everything to a poison you can't see coming." He was sentenced to life without parole in federal prison. Captain Morris received 25 years for his role in the conspiracy. The cleanup of the cabin took months. The biotoxin Kellerman had created was indeed unstable, as Cornelius had warned. It had to be neutralized with extreme care to prevent mutation and spread. But the most disturbing discovery came from Kellerman's encrypted files, recovered from her laptop. She'd been in contact with 12 other buyers worldwide. Each had received partial formulas, not enough to create the weapon alone, but if they collaborated. "It's like she turned biological warfare into a jigsaw puzzle," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Each buyer has pieces. We're trying to track them all down, but some are in countries that won't cooperate." Cornelius Ashworth, whose cooperation had been crucial in stopping Kellerman, had his sentence commuted to a secure psychiatric facility with the possibility of supervised release after 20 years. He continued working with the FBI to develop countermeasures to his own creations. "I opened Pandora's box," he told Jasper during a final interview. "I can't close it, but maybe I can help build defenses against what escaped." The Bramwell family tried to return to normal life, but the experience had changed them. Zechariah installed sophisticated air and water monitoring systems on his property. His children took self-defense classes and learned to recognize signs of chemical contamination. "We were targeted because of a grudge from 60 years ago," Zechariah reflected. "How many other old conflicts are out there, waiting for someone smart and crazy enough to act on them?" Sheriff Jasper Thorndike implemented new protocols for the department: regular inspections of industrial chemical purchases, monitoring of laboratory equipment sales, and closer coordination with federal agencies. But he knew it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a screen door. 3 months after Brennan's conviction, Kellerman was found dead in a car accident that wasn't accidental. A dark web broker who'd facilitated sales was poisoned in federal custody. Judge Brennan survived an attack in prison only because his cellmate, a former Army medic, recognized the symptoms of poisoning and got help in time. Brennan, shaken by his near-death experience, finally revealed everything he knew. Kellerman had a partner, someone she only referred to as the inheritor. They were supposed to be the ultimate buyer, the one who would get the complete formula once she'd tested all the components through other sales. Who are they? I don't know, but Kellerman was terrified of them. She said they had resources beyond anything we could imagine. Government connections, unlimited funding, and a vision for using the biotoxin that made our plans look like child's play. The hunt for the inheritor consumed law enforcement resources across multiple agencies. Every lead dead-ended, every trail went cold. Whoever they were, They operated with a level of sophistication that suggested state-level backing or massive corporate resources. Then, Zechariah Bramwell made a discovery that broke the case open. While renovating his barn, he found surveillance equipment that had been hidden in the walls, not recently, but decades ago, based on the technology. This has been here since the 60s, the FBI tech specialist confirmed. Someone's been watching your family for over 50 years. Similar equipment was found in the ruins of the Ashworth House, in Judge Brennan's former home, even in the courthouse. All of it traced back to a single source, Pinnacle Agricultural Holdings, a subsidiary of a multinational corporation called Prometheus Industries. The CEO of Prometheus Industries was a man named Victor Harwick, Thomas Harwick's older brother. While Thomas had built his agricultural empire through traditional corruption and crime, Victor had taken a different path, using advanced technology and long-term planning to manipulate entire communities. "We've been watching Yavapai County since 1961, Victor Harwick said when finally arrested at his estate in Switzerland and extradited. He showed no emotion, treating his interrogation like a board meeting. It was selected as a test environment for social manipulation experiments, isolated enough to control variables but connected enough to matter. You've been experimenting on American citizens for 60 years? Not experimenting. Preparing. Climate change, resource scarcity, overpopulation, they all lead to the same conclusion. Humanity needs to be cooled, but selectively. The biotoxin Cornelius developed was just one tool we were evaluating. The investigation revealed the horrifying scope of Prometheus Industries' activities. They had similar test communities in 12 countries, each being manipulated and monitored to develop various forms of population control. The water rights disputes, the family feuds, even some of the seemingly random violence, all had been orchestrated or influenced by Prometheus. Cornelius thought he was acting on his own rage, Victor continued. But we'd been feeding him information, stoking his paranoia through seemingly random encounters, online forums we controlled, even through his pharmaceutical colleagues who were our assets. His father's story about the Bramwell theft? We planted those documents for Samuel to find. You created a killer. We revealed one. Cornelius's nature was always violent. We just gave it direction and purpose. The same with Judge Brennan, Dr. Kellerman, and dozens of others. Find the damaged individuals, give them means and motive, then study the results. The trial of Victor Harwick and the dismantling of Prometheus Industries became one of the largest legal proceedings in U.S. history. The conspiracy reached into government agencies, universities, and corporations worldwide. Over 300 individuals were eventually arrested or indicted, but the damage was done. The knowledge of how to create targeted biotoxins was in the wild. The techniques for long-term social manipulation had been perfected and documented. Even with Prometheus Industries destroyed, their legacy would persist. Sheriff Jasper Thorndike testified for days, detailing how his community had been used as a petri dish for testing weapons of mass murder. The residents of Yavapai County filed a class-action lawsuit that would eventually result in billions in settlements, though no amount of money could undo the psychological damage of learning their lives had been manipulated for generations. Zechariah Bramwell took it particularly hard. Every fight with the Ashworths, every business decision, every loss, how much of it was real and how much was them pulling our strings? You made your own choices, Jasper told him. They may have influenced circumstances, but your responses, your values, your love for your family, that was all real. You stopped one small part of a vast machine. Be proud of that. But know that the machine continues to turn. The true inheritors, Jasper gave the hard drive to the FBI, but as predicted, its revelations led nowhere concrete. The trails were too old, the connections too vague, the implications too vast for any government to fully acknowledge or address. He retired a month later, moving to a small cabin in Montana, far from Arizona, far from the memories of how his community had been violated. But he kept copies of everything: documents, evidence, testimonies. Someone needed to remember the truth, even if justice remained incomplete. Deputy Eleanor Pike became the new sheriff, inheriting a county traumatized by revelations of generational manipulation. She implemented new policies, new safeguards, but everyone knew they were essentially meaningless against forces that operated on such a scale. The Bramwell farm continued to operate, but Zechariah installed underground bunkers, air filtration systems, and water purification that could handle any contamination. He'd learned that paranoia wasn't mental illness when they really were out to get you. Judge Brennan died in prison 2 years into his sentence, officially from heart failure, though many suspected he'd finally been successfully poisoned. Captain Morris served his time in silence, never revealing if he knew more about the larger conspiracy. The Ashworth property was eventually purchased by a conservation group and turned into a memorial park for the victims of the biotoxin experiments. A plaque at the entrance read, "In memory of those who died for the ambitions of others, and in warning to those who would use science for evil." But in the end, it was Cornelius Ashworth who had the last word. In his personal effects, returned to the state after his death, was one final journal entry. "They think they created me, molded me, used me. But I always knew. Every whisper they planted, every document they forged, every manipulation they attempted. I saw through it all. I chose to develop the biotoxin not because they manipulated me into it, but because I wanted to see if I could. The Bramwells, the revenge, the justice, all just excuses to do what I was born to do, create death in its purest form. The only difference between me and the inheritors is that I'm honest about what I am. They hide behind corporations and governments, pretending their genocide is policy. I at least owned my monstrosity. The weapon I created will outlive us all. In 100 years, when the waters have risen and the crops have failed, when billions fight over scraps, someone will remember my formulas and use them. Not for revenge or justice or even greed, but for the oldest reason of all, survival of the chosen few at the expense of the many. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And I did it all from a basement laboratory in rural Arizona. Imagine what someone with real resources could do. Sheriff Jasper Thorndyke read those words one last time before burning the journal. Some truths were too dangerous to preserve. But as he watched the pages turn to ash, he knew Cornelius was right. The knowledge was out there, waiting. The next Cornelius, the next Kellerman, the next inheritor, they were already at work somewhere, perfecting what had been started in Yavapai County. The desert property dispute had been resolved in court, but its true legacy was just beginning. In boardrooms and laboratories, in government agencies and criminal organizations, the lessons of the biotoxin were being studied and applied. Jasper spent his remaining years writing warnings, giving talks to law enforcement agencies, trying to prepare them for biological weapons they couldn't see, deployed by enemies they'd never identify. Most thought he was paranoid, traumatized by his experience. But occasionally, someone would listen. Someone would implement new detection systems or investigation protocols. Small victories against an enemy that operated on a scale beyond any one person's ability to fight. As he wrote in his final report before retirement, evil evolves. It adapts to our defenses, finds new ways to manifest. What happened in Yavapai County was not an ending but a beginning. The age of targeted biological warfare has arrived. The only question is whether humanity will survive its own ingenuity. The desert remembers everything. Every drop of blood, every buried secret, every ambitious plan that used its isolation as cover. The Ashworth property stands empty now. The Bramwell farm continues its eternal cycle of planting and harvest, and life goes on. But beneath the surface, in boardrooms and laboratories around the world, the true inheritors of Cornelius Ashworth's legacy continue their work, preparing for a future where death can be delivered with surgical precision to anyone, anywhere, for any reason. The property dispute is over. The war for humanity's future has just begun. Sheriff Nathaniel Blackburn stood at the entrance of the abandoned chapel, 20 miles northeast of Wickenburg, as the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. At 59, his gray beard and weathered face spoke of decades patrolling Maricopa County's vast wilderness areas. But nothing in his 24 years of law enforcement had prepared him for what lay inside the old Spanish mission. The call had come at 5:47 a.m. from a pair of photographers who'd been shooting sunrise landscapes. They'd sought shelter from a sudden dust storm in what they thought was an empty historical site. What they found instead sent them running back to their car, hands shaking too badly to immediately call 911. Deputy Rachel Winters, 32 and sharp as a tack, was already processing the exterior. No fresh tire tracks except the photographer's vehicle, Sheriff. Whoever did this either walked in or their tracks were covered by last night's storm. The chapel, built in 1847 by Spanish missionaries, had been abandoned since the 1920s. Local historians occasionally visited, as did urban explorers and photographers drawn to its crumbling adobe walls and faded frescoes. But mostly, it stood alone in the desert, slowly returning to dust. Nathaniel stepped through the heavy wooden doors, their ancient hinges groaning in protest. The smell hit him first, copper and decay, mixed with something else, something chemical that made his eyes water. As his vision adjusted to the dim interior, illuminated only by shafts of sunlight through holes in the roof, he saw them. 3 bodies, arranged with precise deliberation in front of the altar. They were seated in chairs that must have been brought here for this purpose. The chapel's original pews had long since rotted away. Each victim's hands were folded in prayer, held in place by wire. Their heads were bowed, faces obscured, but the amount of blood pooling beneath them told its own story. Jesus Christ, Deputy Winters breathed behind him. Get the state police and FBI on the line, Nathaniel ordered. Full forensics team, and nobody else comes in here until they arrive. As Winters made the calls, Nathaniel carefully approached the bodies, documenting everything with his phone camera. The victims appeared to be men, all middle-aged to elderly based on their clothing and builds. They'd been dead for at least several days, maybe a week, based on the level of decomposition. But it was what he found at their feet that made his blood run cold. 3 leather journals, each placed precisely in front of a victim, each soaked in blood but still partially readable. He photographed them without touching, zooming in on the visible pages. The writing was in different hands. These were the victim's own journals, and from what he could read, they were confessions. The first journal's visible page read, "Forgive me for what I did to my partners. Stole everything from the company accounts. Henderson, Morrison, and Vasquez trusted me, and I destroyed them. $3 million, 3 ruined lives. They all committed suicide because of what I did. Phoenix, 1998 to 2001. The second, burned down their businesses because they were competition. 7 buildings, 12 families destroyed, made it look like electrical failures, accidents. Fire Marshal Williams helped cover it up for a cut. The Garcias died in the third fire. I knew they lived above their restaurant, knew they'd never escape in time. The third was mostly obscured by blood, but he could make out. Contaminated the water supply at the mine, saved the company millions in cleanup costs. 37 workers got cancer. 23 are dead now. I have all their names memorized. They haunt me. Nathaniel stepped back, his mind racing. These weren't random victims. Someone had specifically targeted these men for their crimes, brought them here, and executed them in this theatrical manner. This was vigilante justice dressed up as religious judgment. The forensics team arrived within 2 hours, led by Dr. Patricia Huang from Phoenix. As they processed the scene, more disturbing details emerged. The victims had been killed elsewhere and transported here post-mortem. The blood patterns suggested they'd been tortured before death, systematically, professionally. Each victim died differently, Dr. Huang reported. One from exsanguination, one from poison, one from strangulation. But all 3 were tortured first. Whoever did this wanted them to suffer, but also wanted them to confess. See these marks on their arms? Injection sites? I'm betting we'll find they were drugged with something to make them compliant, maybe even truthful. The victims were identified by evening. Harold Morrison, 68, former CFO of Sunrise Development Corporation, which had collapsed in 2001 after massive embezzlement was discovered, though Morrison had never been charged due to lack of evidence. Frank Calabresi, 72, retired businessman who'd owned a string of retail stores in the 1990s. Several competitors had lost everything in suspicious fires during that period. And Benjamin Cross, 64, former safety inspector for Coronado Mining Company, which had paid out hundreds of millions in cancer settlements, though no individual was ever held responsible. 3 men who escaped justice, Deputy Winters observed. Someone decided to correct that. The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI took over, given the interstate implications, but Nathaniel remained involved as the local authority. Agent Marcus Stone, a behavioral analyst from Quantico, arrived to profile the killer. "This is highly organized," Stone said, reviewing the evidence. The killer spent months, maybe years, researching these victims. They knew their crimes, had evidence of guilt, and chose this specific location for its symbolism. An abandoned chapel, a place of judgment, now itself judged and found wanting. The journals were carefully preserved and analyzed. They contained detailed confessions, written in the victim's own hands. Morrison admitted to embezzling over $3 million, destroying his partner's lives. Calabresi confessed to 7 counts of arson, resulting in 2 deaths. Cross detailed how he'd falsified safety reports, allowing toxic contamination that killed 23 miners. "The question is," Agent Stone said, "how did our killer know about these crimes? And how did they get these men to confess?" The answer came from toxicology reports. Each victim had been injected with a cocktail of drugs, including sodium pentothal, truth serum, and a powerful psychedelic that would have made them highly suggestible. They'd been psychologically and chemically broken down until they confessed everything. 3 days into the investigation, Nathaniel received a package at his office. No return address, no postmark. It had been hand-delivered during the night shift when the desk sergeant had stepped away. Inside was a flash drive and a typed note. Sheriff Blackburn, the 3 men in the chapel were killers who escaped earthly justice through wealth and connections. They were not the first I've judged, and they won't be the last. This drive contains evidence of their crimes. recordings, documents, photographs they thought were destroyed. Use it to bring peace to their victims' families. I am not a monster. I am a correction. The system you serve protects the powerful and abandons the powerless. I protect the powerless and punish the powerful. There are more who need judgment. Corporate executives who knowingly poisoned communities. Politicians who sold votes that cost lives. Police who murdered with badges and walked free. They think they're safe because statutes of limitations expired, evidence disappeared, witnesses died. They're wrong. The next judgment comes at the new moon, the penitent. The flash drive contained exactly what the note promised. Overwhelming evidence of the 3 victims' crimes. Financial records proving Morrison's embezzlement. Surveillance footage of Calabrese setting fires. Internal memos showing Cross knew about the contamination and covered it up. It was all there, meticulously organized and indisputable. This killer had access to sealed records, destroyed evidence, things that should be impossible to obtain, Agent Stone noted. They're either in law enforcement or have someone inside feeding them information. The investigation turned inward, examining everyone with access to old case files and evidence storage. Meanwhile, Nathaniel couldn't shake a terrible thought. He knew about other cases like these. Other criminals who'd escaped justice through technicalities, corruption, or simple incompetence. If this killer was targeting them, there was a long list of potential victims. He started making calls, warning retired officers and officials who'd been involved in controversial cases. Most dismissed his concerns, but a few took it seriously enough to increase their security. 5 days into the investigation, they got their first real lead. Security footage from a gas station 10 miles from the chapel showed a van matching tire tracks found near the scene. The driver was careful to avoid showing their face, but they were clearly alone. One person had managed all this. The van was traced to a rental company in Phoenix. The name on the rental agreement was fake, but the credit card was real. Registered to a shell company called Judgment Services, LLC. Following that thread led to more shell companies, fake addresses, and dead ends. Whoever the penitent was, they'd been planning this for a long time. Deputy Winters discovered something interesting in the historical records of the chapel. In the 1920s, it had been the site of a vigilante hanging. 3 men accused of cattle rustling had been lynched there by a mob, despite protesting their innocence. They were later proven innocent when the real thieves were caught. Our killer chose this place deliberately, Winters said. A place where false justice was once dispensed, now being used for what they see as true justice. A week after the bodies were discovered, Nathaniel was working late when his computer received an encrypted email. The sender was listed as penitent1847@protonmail.com, 1847 being the year the chapel was built. The email contained a single line. Check the Morrison family cemetery plot, southeast corner. 3 feet down. Against protocol, Nathaniel went alone. He told himself it was to verify before wasting resources. But really, something about this case had gotten under his skin. At the cemetery, using a small shovel from his trunk, he dug where indicated. 3 feet down, wrapped in plastic, was a metal box. Inside were photographs and documents dating back to 2001. They showed Harold Morrison meeting with a man Nathaniel recognized, Judge William Brennan, who dismissed the embezzlement case against Morrison for lack of evidence. The photos showed Brennan taking an envelope clearly full of cash. There was also a USB drive containing audio recordings of Morrison and Brennan discussing the bribe, planning how to make the evidence disappear, laughing about how Morrison's partners had gotten what they deserved for trying to push him out of the company. Judge Brennan had died of a heart attack 3 years ago, But this evidence would have destroyed his legacy and implicated others still living who'd helped cover up the crime. Nathaniel sat in his car outside the cemetery, wrestling with what to do. The evidence was obtained illegally. It couldn't be used in court, but it proved the penitent's point. The system had failed. Morrison had bought his freedom while his victim suffered. His phone buzzed. Another encrypted email. You see it now, don't you, Sheriff? How deep the rot goes. Brennan was one of 12 judges in Arizona taking bribes. I have evidence on all of them. Some are retired, some still sit on the bench. What does your law do about that? Nathaniel typed back, The law isn't perfect, but vigilante justice isn't the answer. The response came quickly. 3 of Morrison's partners killed themselves because of what he did. The Garcia's daughter grew up without parents because of Calabrese. 23 families lost fathers, husbands, brothers to Cross's greed. Where was the law for them? Let me help you do this right. Turn yourself in. Provide the evidence legally. We can get justice through the system. The system is the problem, Sheriff. But I'll give you a chance to prove me wrong. Judge Patricia Hansen, currently presiding over the Sanders murder trial. She's taken $200,000 to ensure acquittal. The payment went through her husband's consulting firm yesterday. Stop her, and I'll consider your way. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. The Sanders trial was high profile. A wealthy developer accused of killing his business partner. If Judge Hansen was corrupt, he spent the rest of the night investigating quietly. By morning, he'd found enough suspicious activity around Judge Hansen's husband's accounts to warrant a deeper look. He brought it to the FBI, who discovered the bribery attempt was real, but it was also a sting operation. Judge Hansen had reported the bribe attempt and was working with federal agents to catch whoever was behind it. The penitent had been testing him, but the test had revealed something else. There really were people trying to corrupt the system, even if this particular judge hadn't fallen for it. 2 weeks after the chapel murders, the new moon arrived. Nathaniel had extra patrols out, warnings issued to potential targets, everyone on high alert. But the penitent was smarter than that. The bodies were found in 3 different locations across Arizona, all discovered within the same hour. Each victim was positioned identically, kneeling, hands bound in prayer, a confession pinned to their chest. The first was in Tucson. Robert Henley, former pharmaceutical executive who'd knowingly sold contaminated drugs that killed 43 people. His confession detailed how he'd hidden test results and bribed FDA officials. The second in Flagstaff, Maria Santos, former city councilwoman who'd taken kickbacks to approve a toxic waste dump that poisoned groundwater for 3 neighborhoods. Her confession named every official she'd paid off. The third in Yuma, Detective Carl Morrison, no relation to Harold, who'd planted evidence to convict innocent people while letting the guilty go free for payment. His confession included 37 cases he'd corrupted. All 3 had been grabbed from their homes, despite security measures, drugged and tortured into confessing, then executed and displayed. The coordination required was staggering. The penitent had to have help, or be multiple people, or possess resources beyond what they'd assumed. Agent Stone revised his profile. This isn't a lone vigilante. This is an organization, trained, funded, and dedicated to their cause. They have medical knowledge for the drugs, legal knowledge to identify targets, technical skills to avoid detection, and the philosophical conviction to see it through. The media had gotten hold of the story by now. The penitent killer was front-page news. Public opinion was disturbingly split. Many condemned the murders, but others openly supported the killing of corrupt individuals who'd escaped justice. Online forums celebrating the penitent sprouted up faster than they could be shut down. Nathaniel found himself in an impossible position. He was sworn to uphold the law and catch the penitent, but every piece of evidence they provided revealed real corruption, real crimes that had gone unpunished. How could he protect people who deserved to be in prison? Late one night, exhausted and frustrated, he drove out to the desert alone to think. At a remote overlook where he often went to clear his head, he found someone waiting for him. It was a woman, mid-40s, professionally dressed, but with the kind of alertness that suggested military or law enforcement training. She kept her hands visible, but stood in a way that suggested she could reach a weapon quickly if needed. "Sheriff Blackburn," she said calmly. "We need to talk." "Are you the penitent?" "I'm one of many." "We're not killers, Sheriff. We're surgeons, removing cancer from the body of society. Every person we've judged was guilty of crimes that cost innocent lives. The system you serve protected them. You're taking the law into your own hands. The law abandoned its responsibilities. We're simply filling the void." She pulled out a thick folder. "This contains evidence on 17 more individuals in Arizona who've escaped justice for capital crimes. Judges, politicians, business leaders, even police, all guilty, all free. I won't let you kill them, then arrest them. You have 48 hours before we act. Show us the system works and we'll stand down. Fail, and we continue our work." She walked away into the darkness before Nathaniel could respond, leaving him with the folder. Inside were detailed dossiers on 17 people, including evidence that would be inadmissible in court but was utterly convincing of guilt. Nathaniel spent the next day trying to build legal cases against the 17 names. But every avenue hit a wall: statutes of limitations, destroyed evidence, jurisdictional issues, or simple corruption. One target was a sitting congressman with immunity. Another was a billionaire with an army of lawyers. A third had already fled to a non-extradition country after being tipped off. 48 hours later, 3 more bodies were found. The 3 new victims were discovered simultaneously at dawn, each in a location symbolic of their crimes. Marcus, a former water rights attorney, was found at Lake Pleasant, positioned overlooking the nearly empty reservoir he'd helped drain through illegal deals. Jennifer Cross, ex-CEO of a medical insurance company, was displayed at the abandoned Desert Bloom Hospital her policies had forced to close. Thomas Ashford, a construction magnate who'd used substandard materials, causing a building collapse that killed 8, was found at the memorial site for those victims. Each body bore the same signs: torture, forced confession, execution. But this time, the penitent had left something new. Video recordings of the confessions, uploaded simultaneously to dozens of platforms. Before they could be taken down, millions had watched Marcus admit to taking bribes that diverted water from poor communities to wealthy developments. Jennifer Cross detailed how she'd systematically denied coverage to terminal patients to boost profits. Thomas Ashford broke down crying as he named every corner he'd cut, every safety violation he'd hidden. The public reaction was explosive. Protests erupted at government buildings demanding to know why these criminals had never been prosecuted. The victims' families, those who'd lost loved ones to these people's greed, gave interviews saying the penitent had given them the justice the system denied. Sheriff Nathaniel Blackburn found himself at the center of a media storm. Reporters demanded to know how the penitent kept evading capture. Politicians called for his resignation. But worst were the emails and calls from citizens saying he should stop trying to catch the penitent at all. Agent Marcus Stone convened an emergency task force meeting. Representatives from FBI, ATF, DEA, and NSA were present. This had become a national security issue. "We've identified patterns in the penitent's operations," Stone began. They have access to sealed records from multiple agencies. They have medical training. The drug cocktails they use are precisely calibrated. They have significant financial resources. We're tracking over $3 million in expenses just for equipment and vehicles. And they have technological sophistication. They're using encrypted networks we can't crack. It's an inside job, declared Agent Patricia from Internal Affairs. Has to be. Someone in law enforcement, probably multiple someones. The investigation turned inward, scrutinizing everyone with access to the relevant systems. Meanwhile, Nathaniel couldn't stop thinking about his encounter with the woman in the desert. Her military bearing, her knowledge of his habits, the way she'd known exactly where to find him. She had to be law enforcement or ex-military. 3 days later, Nathaniel received another encrypted message. Sheriff Blackburn, you tried to work within the system and failed. Tonight, we judge 3 more. But I offer you one last chance. Come alone to Weaver's Needle at midnight. Learn the truth. Choose a side. Weaver's Needle was a volcanic rock formation in the Superstition Mountains, a landmark visible for miles but treacherous to climb, especially at night. Going alone would be suicidal if this was a trap. But Nathaniel had a feeling the penitent didn't want him dead. They wanted him converted. Against all protocol, against every instinct, he went. The climb took 2 hours in the darkness, following a barely visible trail marked by small reflectors someone had placed recently. At the summit, he found not one person but 5, all wearing tactical gear with faces covered. The woman from the desert was clearly their leader. "Sheriff," she said, removing her mask. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. He recognized her immediately. Special Agent Diana Vasquez, who'd supposedly died in a car accident 2 years ago while investigating corruption in the Phoenix Police Department. "Diana, you're alive?" "The accident was staged. I was getting too close to the truth, a network of corrupt officials that went all the way to Washington. They tried to have me killed. I survived, went underground, and found others like me. Officers who'd been forced out for refusing to play along. Prosecutors who'd been destroyed for pursuing the powerful. Judges who'd been removed for not taking bribes. The others removed their masks. Nathaniel recognized 3 of them. All law enforcement officers who'd supposedly died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. "We're not vigilantes," Diana continued. "We're what law enforcement should be. Incorruptible, uncompromising, effective. You're murderers. We're executioners. There's a difference. Every person we've killed was guilty of capital crimes. We gave them the same mercy they gave their victims. None." One of the others, former Detective James Harper, stepped forward. "You know what it's like, Nathaniel. Watching guilty people walk free because they have money or connections. Seeing evidence disappear, witnesses intimidated, cases thrown out on technicalities. The system is broken. So you decided to replace it with your own?" "We decided to fix it," Diana said. "Those 17 names I gave you. We knew you couldn't arrest them legally, but now you know who they are. You can watch them, limit their damage, maybe even catch them in new crimes. While you murder them one by one. Only if necessary. We'd prefer they face legal justice, but if they don't," she shrugged. "We're patient. We can wait years if needed, but eventually everyone faces judgment." Nathaniel looked at the 5 people before him, all trained law enforcement, all people he'd once respected. "How many more of you are there?" "Enough," Diana said. "In every state, in every major city. Growing every day as more officers see the truth. The system protects the powerful and punishes the weak. We're reversing that equation. I can't let you continue. You can't stop us." Even if you arrested all 5 of us right now, others would continue the work. We're not an organization. We're an idea, and ideas can't be killed. She pulled out a thick folder. But we don't want to be enemies, Nathaniel. This contains evidence on a human trafficking ring operating through Arizona. 14 locations, 63 victims currently captive, run by people so connected that previous investigations were shut down. You can try to handle it legally and we'll stay out of your way. Or you can fail and we'll handle it our way. It was both an offer and a threat. Join them, or at least don't oppose them, and they'd feed him information on real criminals. Fight them, and the killing would continue. I need time to think, Nathaniel said. You have 1 week. The trafficking ring moves their victims every month. Clocks ticking, they disappeared into the darkness, leaving Nathaniel alone on the mountain with the folder. Inside was detailed intelligence on the trafficking operation. Photos, financial records, locations. It was real, actionable, and would save lives if he used it. The climb down was treacherous in the dark, but Nathaniel's escaped, tipped off by someone in the department, but the operation was crippled. The media hailed it as brilliant police work. The rescued victims tearfully thanked Nathaniel on camera, but he knew the truth. Without the penitent's intelligence, those people would still be captive. A week after Weaver's Needle, 3 more bodies were found. But these weren't the typical penitent victims. These were the trafficking ringleaders who'd escaped the raids. Tortured, confessed, executed. Their confessions implicated dozens of others, including 2 state senators and a federal judge. The public reaction was even more divided. Many openly celebrated the deaths of human traffickers. Others worried about the breakdown of law and order. The governor called for martial law. The president announced a federal task force to hunt the penitent. But Nathaniel had made his decision. He couldn't join the penitent. His oath meant too much. But he couldn't fully oppose them either. They were filling a void the system had created. He would walk a middle path, using their intelligence when possible, trying to get legal justice before they resorted to execution. The encrypted messages continued, each providing information on crimes the system had ignored. Sometimes Nathaniel succeeded in making arrests. Sometimes he didn't, and bodies would appear days later. It was an uneasy détente, a dance between official law and vigilante justice. 6 months later, Diana Vasquez contacted him one last time. "We're leaving Arizona," she said during another midnight desert meeting. "Our work here is done for now. The corrupt are scared, the innocent have hope, and you've proven that some cops still care about real justice. Where will you go?" "Wherever we're needed. California, Texas, New York. Corruption exists everywhere. I should arrest you, but you won't, because you know that tomorrow another victim will need help that the system won't provide. Another criminal will escape justice through wealth or connections, and when that happens, you'll wish we were still here." She handed him a phone. "For emergencies only. When you find a case the system can't or won't handle, call. We'll always answer." Nathaniel took the phone, hating himself for it but knowing she was right. The system was broken, perhaps irreparably. The penitent were a symptom, not the disease. As Diana walked away, she turned back one last time. "We're not heroes, Nathaniel. We're what happens when heroes fail. When good cops like you are handcuffed by laws that protect the guilty. We're the last resort, the final judgment. And as long as injustice exists, so will we." The penitent disappeared from Arizona, but their legacy remained. Crime rates plummeted as criminals feared judgment. Corruption decreased as officials worried about late-night visits. And in his desk drawer, Sheriff Nathaniel Blackburn kept a phone that he hoped he'd never have to use, but knew he probably would. The case was officially closed, unsolved. The FBI task force was quietly disbanded after finding no actionable leads. The media moved on to other stories. Life returned to normal, or what passed for normal. But sometimes, late at night, Nathaniel would get anonymous tips about crimes that needed investigating. Sometimes he'd hear about bodies found in other states, positioned in prayer, confessions pinned to their chests. And sometimes, when he arrested someone who'd bought their way out of justice before, they'd look at him with real fear and ask, "Are you one of them? Are you penitent?" He'd always say no. It was even mostly true. The abandoned chapel where it all began was demolished by the state, deemed structurally unsound. But locals said that on certain nights you could still hear whispers on the wind, confessions of the guilty, prayers of the innocent, and somewhere between them, the sound of justice being served, one judgment at a time. Sheriff Nathaniel Blackburn served 3 more years before retiring, his conscience heavy with compromises and necessary evils. His replacement found the encrypted phone in the desk drawer with a simple note, "For when the system fails." The new sheriff threw the phone away, determined to do things by the book. 6 months later, after watching 3 child traffickers walk free on technicalities, he went searching through the garbage files in evidence storage. The phone was still there, still charged, still waiting. He made the call. On the other end, a familiar voice answered, "We've been expecting you." The work continues, and so it did, in shadows and darkness, in the spaces between law and justice, where the penitent waited with patience and purpose, ready to judge those who thought themselves beyond judgment, to punish those who believed themselves above punishment. The system remained broken. But now, at least, the guilty had something to fear. And sometimes, in a world of imperfect justice, fear was the closest thing to righteousness that remained.